Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of Blown Off Course, written by David Donaghy. Read by Jonathan Keeble. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE26 2JT. Prologue. John Pearce knew he was wasting his time almost as soon as he sat down. Besides, in revisiting the Pelican Tavern, a place he had previously avoided, the thoughts both memory and his presence induced were far from pleasant, the whole not aided by the way his day had gone thus far, that compounded by a touch of lonely introspection. He had sent his good friend Michael O'Hagan back to Portsmouth to tell the other two men who formed his circle that matters were in hand that would see them free from worry. Then, as arranged, he had called upon the office of the First Lord of the Treasury in Downing Street, expecting to receive there the results of certain promises that had been made to him the previous evening, letters that would quickly and smoothly ease the lives of his companions in misfortune, as well as a possible commission taking him back to the Mediterranean. Neither had been forthcoming, and nor had any explanation been offered for their absence. A request to see William Pitt had been scoffed at, then brushed aside, as that turned to a demand. It had been made abundantly plain to him he was not important enough to force the issue, and no time had been given to him in which his concerns might be resolved. Time was pressing. All three of his friends were now in some danger, instead of just two, so, determined to force matters and having left an address at which he could be contacted, Pearce made his way to the Admiralty. He had in his possession a letter from Rear Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, which should partially realise what he required, as well as a written submission of his own he had always intended to be used. That the two buildings were not far apart was one blessing. It curtailed his anger at being so badly treated by the King's First Minister, as well as his speculations as to what had changed overnight. He thought he had struck a bargain, and, whatever his opinion of Billy Pitt, he had not had him down as a man who failed to keep his word, unlike the other politician who had been present last night. Henry Dundas, Pitt's political fixer, a fellow Scot who commanded many votes in the House of Commons, was, to John Pearce, a poisonous snake of a man. Dundas had been responsible for much trouble in his life, as well as that of his late father, the radical orator and pamphleteer Adam Pearce. Pitt had been clear in what he wanted. John Pearce had been his messenger before, and would be so again. In return, he would get, without the trouble of demanding them from the Admiralty, 3 protections from naval impressment, as well as 2 writs for arrest suspended. Had Dundas been lukewarm? Had he changed Pitt's thinking after Pearce departed? He did not know, and speculation was useless. That was a matter which would have to wait. Just to get into the Admiralty building, he had been required to excessively tip a sour-faced and deeply inquisitive doorman, a fellow who reacted to his name as though the notion of this visitor holding a lieutenant's rank in the King's Navy was an affront to be taken personally. Finally allowed through to an anteroom, his letters passed on, he had sat waiting to be seen. This while officers of a higher rank and greater heft, arriving later, were waved through to interview, leaving him and the other queuing supplicants to quietly fester at the lack of even-handedness. The morning had gone, and so had noon, with no sign of him being granted an interview. Eyeing those who waited with him did nothing for a mood which grew darker with each passing hour. A captain of advanced years and apparently little in the way of interest, waiting to beg for an appointment. Lieutenants of various ages seeking employment of any kind. The impress service, if all else failed. The one thing they all shared, apart from the pique of being constantly passed over, was an air of quiet desperation that underlined their hushed conversations. Pearce had stayed silent and deliberately morose. His thoughts left him little choice, more than once avoiding a complicit eye that sought to engage him in the kind of talk common in naval circles, of service past and the possibility of shared acquaintance. He had no desire, especially after his reception at the front gate, to even proffer his name, lest in doing so he open himself up to inquiry. For if he wore, like these other men, the coat of a king's officer, he wore it reluctantly. Quite apart from that, he had his reputation and the means by which he had achieved his rank, which even in an establishment of some 2,000 officers would be the subject of common gossip and lurid opinion, neither of which he wished to be exposed. If even a lowly Admiralty porter knew his story, then these others would have knowledge of it too. That he had been right to remain silent was underlined by the raised eyebrows and startled expressions which greeted the use of his name sonorously announced by a footman. "Lieutenant John Pearce." There was a degree of disdain in this fellow's look too, as he responded to an affirmative reply. "Admiral Affleck will see you next." A buzz of animated conversation followed him out, most larded with surprise, or perhaps venom from those who, in recognizing the name, would see him as an undeserving upstart. Yet there would be jealousy too, especially from those recently commissioned, who would realize that if they had been sitting in the same room with a fellow of murky elevation, they had also been within talking distance of a man who had enjoyed the good fortune for which they craved. They had not only failed to nail his identity, but missed an opportunity to press for details, to hear of his exploits from his own lips. The room he had entered, home to the Board of Admiralty, was spacious and rectangular, lit by 3 large windows that struggled to illuminate the dark panelling of the walls. Outside could be heard the muted sounds of Whitehall, one of the busiest thoroughfares in London. Street hawkers and peddlers, hoarse military commands from the barracks of the Horse Guards, carriages in such quantity and so lacking in discipline that endless disputes resulted on who had the right of way. At one end of the boardroom table sat Admiral Philip Affleck, the most junior of the naval lords, his indifference to the visitor obvious by the way he flicked a finger and spoke, not to mention the contemptuous tone of his voice. "Please address yourself to the Secretary of the Board, Lieutenant. I have little interest in you or your business." The man in question, Philip Stevens, sat to one side at a separate desk. He was elderly, arrogant of eye, and with disapproving shape to his mouth, features that were set off by the dry, pallid skin of a lifelong indoor man. Having shown no curiosity whatsoever, barely acknowledging his entry, he had examined the letter Pearce had sent in earlier with a jaundiced expression, his greying eyebrows rising towards his like-coloured wig, as if the contents were in some way bizarre, and the signature at the bottom quite possibly a forgery. He then picked up Pearce's own submission, a request that the persons named, having been released from naval service by the officer in command of the Mediterranean fleet, be granted exemptions that would protect them from the risk of being once more pressed. Then it was back to the letter, which was waved slightly. "This in itself does not provide means for your request, sir." "I cannot see how it fails to, Mr. Stevens. Admiral Hyde Parker penned it on the instructions of Lord Hood. He has freed these men from the Navy on the very good grounds that their original impressment was illegal." "It does not say that, Mr. Pearce." "No, but I do." That brought forth a snort of disapproval from a supposedly disinterested Admiral Affleck. "Hardly grounds to give out such documents to, Stevens hesitated and made much of picking up an eyeglass to look at the names. "O'Hagan, Taverner, and Domit, is it? Protections are not things to be handed out lightly at such a time, when the fleet is so short of hands to man her ships. I need hardly remind you we are at war with a most vicious enemy." If Pearce was cursing Hyde Parker for being imprecise, he was also silently castigating himself for failing to make sure the intentions of the communication were clear. The release and future safety of the trio had been part of their arrangement, a reward for his services to Lord Hood. That his friends, the men with whom he had been pressed himself, should, in theory, be free to walk the streets of England in safety. At the moment, Charlie and Rufus were anchored off Portsmouth, stuck aboard the badly damaged frigate, HMS Fury, with Michael on his way to rejoin and reassure them. She had lost all her masts in a ferocious Biscay storm, before rescuing them from off the coast of Brittany from near certain captivity. The original intention for everyone to travel with John Pearce had been set aside for several reasons. One being, and this was where theory parted with practicality, that 2 of his companions had writs out for their arrest. It had been these Pitt had agreed to quash, the provision of 3 protections more gilding than necessity, given he had the means to acquire them anyway. The writs were probably not much of a problem in Hampshire, but one that would increase as they approached London. There was also the cost of 4 souls travelling at £1 a mile. Pearce had only a limited amount of money with which to pay, having been required to expend a fair bit of his coin to buy slops and the like from the frigate's purser, for those with whom he had been rescued, this to replace items lost at sea. His own blue coat had suffered so much he had been obliged to buy a second-hand replacement from a Portsmouth tailor, on the very good grounds that to appear in Whitehall in a singed and torn garment would not serve. He had also seen, when seeking to book his passage, how many eager eyes studied the London coach, plus the knowledge he possessed from previous journeys that every post-house on the way to the capital was a magnet for those hunting naval deserters. His friends bore the marks of their service. Pigtails grown as hobbies could be cut and jaunty clothing discarded, but there was no disguising a sailor's gait, plus the ruddy complexion occasioned by exposure to the constant wind, while even a cursory examination would spot palms ingrained with tar. In theory, being with a commissioned officer, someone who could vouch for them, should be protection enough. But the writs out for Charlie Taverner and Rufus Dommett complicated matters. It was no secret that men ran to sea from the law, which always exposed sailors to extra scrutiny from a whole stratum of folk who made their living from the trade in bounties. It was a truism John Pearce knew from his previous travelling life. In a strange setting, you never knew who was who and what they were about. As an enterprise, travelling together was not only too expensive, it was too risky. So he had travelled with Michael O'Hagan, the Irishman's safety secured by his coat, and, sure that matters were in hand, he had sent him back again with a leave pass, which would pass muster on the road and protect him from interference. No one scrutinised a sailor going to a ship, only those who could not prove they were not running from one, and, in doing so, had inadvertently put him at risk. For now, time was of the essence. HMS Fury would not remain at anchor forever. She was slated to be warped into the dockyard for repairs, which would remove the element of safety his friends now enjoyed. That he was angry at this moment, he knew. Yet he was also aware that to let that show would not serve with a functionary like the fellow before him. Stevens was accustomed to the tirades of men of much higher rank than he. Pearce hated to beg. It went right against the grain of his being, but he kept in the forefront of his thinking that he was not seeking something for himself. He was pleading for others, and that allowed him to suppress his ire and address Stevens in a firm but even tone, speaking more in hope than certainty. "It is also the wish of the First Lord of the Treasury, Mr. Stevens, which I am willing to undertake to confirm. I take it a note from Mr. William Pitt supporting Admiral Parker's letter will sway matters." That got him a crabbed look. The notion that he, a mere lieutenant of limited service time and ambiguous elevation, could call upon the assistance of the King's First Minister was surprising. But then Stevens's already hooded eyes had narrowed and flicked towards Admiral Affleck, which told Pearce the Secretary had recalled how he came by his rank, gifted to him at the insistence of King George himself. He surely could not call to mind that singular event without also recollecting the circumstances that brought it about, the capture of a French ship of the line, which must cause him to surmise he was not dealing with an ordinary officer. Before him, was a fellow for whom the expression still waters could have been coined. For John Pearce ran very deep indeed, perhaps too deep for even a powerful Admiralty Secretary or a naval lord to gainsay.
"Is it not strange, indeed?"
Stevens intoned, employing a sepulchral air that went with his desiccated, colourless appearance,
"as well as an indication of the troubled times in which we live, that a man can go from being so recently under the threat of a King's Bench warrant to being able to call upon the services of the minister who had it issued."
That had the hitherto silent Admiral expelling the air from his lungs through flapping lips, in a way very reminiscent of a bored horse.
"Be assured," Pearce replied, with a confidence wholly false, "that I can do so, and on this very day."
It was to salve both his pride and the authority of the board that Stevens concluded the interview in the way he did. Inclined to refuse, he was certain. Given the power of Pearce's connections, he must accede. But the least he could do was make the man before him wait for something he could order completed by a mere ring of a bell.
"Call back on the morrow, and they will be handed to you."
The eyes went back to the papers that littered his desk, numerous, for Philip Stevens was the man who really ran the King's Navy, an organisation which, in its complexity and reach, was the wonder of the world.
"Good day, Lieutenant Pearce."
"Obliged, sir," Pearce replied, producing the courtesy, even if he did not feel any had been forthcoming. As he was about to leave the room, Stevens delivered a parting shot.
"And please remember, Lieutenant, to bring with you the requisite fees for these protections."
Which left him asking, as he exited the gate of the Admiralty building in a foul temper, recalling as he did the way he had been obliged to pay even for the letters granting him his lieutenant's rank, if there was anything the Navy did that was not accompanied by a demand for a fee. Chapter 1. In coming to the Pelican Tavern, Pearce had, perforce, to enter the liberties of the Savoy, that strip by the River Thames where many of the writs that constituted the law of the land did not run. In doing so, he had passed many a sharp eye, and had been studied with care, looks that belonged to men who made their living from taking up miscreants with writs against their name. Most for debt, many were for minor crimes, like those of Charlie Taverner, who had worked as a sharp in the nearby areas to the north, the Strand and Covent Garden, preying on and duping the innocent or the foolish. Outrageous schemes promising fabulous returns, forged lottery tickets, fake watch auctions, and a bit of dipping had been Charlie's stock in trade. Rufus Dommett, an innocent sort of fellow who looked younger even than his tender years, had run from an onerous apprentice bond, a crime in the eyes of an unforgiving law. This was the place where he had first met them, and that pair, barring the Sabbath, if Pitt reneged on his commitment, would still be at risk of arrest outside the confines of the liberties, protections or not. Once inside and divested of his boat cloak, home to roaring fires and a healthy fug of pipe smoke, he sought out and parked himself in the same seat as the one at which he had first met them, ordering some much-needed food and a tankard of warming metheglin. This gave him, from the very back of the room, as it had on that foul and windy night, a good view of the door through which he had entered. Pearce had been on the run himself then, from the King's Bench warrant so recently alluded to by Philip Stevens, as well as the powerful bailiffs employed by the courts to execute such writs and apprehend the putative villain. His crime, in truth that of his father, had been called sedition, a much more serious transgression than the offences common in the liberties, one that could end at Tyburn if those who hated radical writings were inclined to press matters to an execution. From this very perch he had watched Michael O'Hagan lift a hefty pine bench using nothing but his teeth, an indication, if his height and bulk were insufficient, of his massive natural strength. The giant Irishman had been mightily drunk before his feat, and even more so afterwards. If he had been sober, there was not a press gang in the world could have taken him up without he felled most of those trying. Eyes ranging over the room, Pearce took in the door by the serving hatch, through which he had tried to escape, only to run into those set there to catch their fleeing quarry, which brought about his first encounter with Captain Ralph Barclay, the man he now saw as his mortal enemy.
"Such a ferocious stare, sir. I would not want to be the object of your ruminations."
Pearce looked up at the man who stood before him, into a winning smile in an amiable, handsome face, immediately relaxing his own compressed features.
"I was lost in recollection, sir." "Then damned unpleasant they must have been, Lieutenant." "I was recalling the night a press gang burst into this very room and carted off all the able-bodied men, myself included." "That was but a year past, was it not?"
the stranger said, his eye running over the uniform coat with an air of deep curiosity.
"Then you know of it?" "Sir, it has been the talk of the place ever since, almost the first subject to which I was made aware, when I moved my place of business to a set of chambers close by, and began to come to the Pelican for refreshment. Allow me to name myself. Arthur Winston. And you, sir, are—"
"John Pearce."
"And you were pressed that night?"
"I was."
"An act which is illegal in this part of the metropolis."
That made Pearce smile. So unaccustomed was he to that misconduct being acknowledged. The liberties of the Savoy came under the legal jurisdiction of the Duchy of Lancaster, they being the boundaries of the long-gone Savoy Palace, which had been home to John of Gaunt, third son of the King Edward, who won at Crecy, progenitor of the bloodline which had produced in his grandson Henry the more famous victor of Agincourt. For several centuries, because of its exempt status outside the control of the royal courts, it had provided sanctuary for the less salubrious citizens of London and Westminster. One of the statutes of the liberties, well frequented by Thames watermen, was that it was against the law to seek to press seamen from within its confines. Seeing agreement in Pearce's expression, Winston added in a sombre tone, "But I suspect you are familiar with that to an uncomfortable degree." He leant forward to see into Pearce's near-empty tankard. "Would you permit me to purchase you a refill, sir?" A look of suspicion crossed Pearce's face. He could not help it. For life, since childhood, traversing the whole of the kingdom in the company of his radical father, had attuned him to distrust unwarranted and too spontaneous generosity, often the precursor to an attempt at chicanery. Yet it disappeared as fast as it surfaced. What possible harm could there be in taking a tankard from this fellow? "I confess a purpose, sir," Winston said, his face solemn. "I am agog to hear of what happened to you, and how, in the name of creation, after so short a time, you can be wearing what I assume is a uniform coat of a rank to which you are entitled." Avoiding a direct answer, being guarded about the story of his elevation to a lieutenant's rank, Pearce grinned, invited the fellow to sit down, and accepted the invitation to drink, this time a tankard of porter. Perhaps it was the fact that he was nothing to do with the King's Navy, or even that he was an habitué of the Pelican, and thus something of a soulmate to his friends, stuck in Portsmouth, awaiting their protections. As the serving wench, called over with her jug to provide the necessary, came towards them, Pearce, seeing the depth and extent of her visible bosom, as well as the width of her hips, was reminded of Rosie, another fulsome girl first seen on that ill-fated night, one who had enjoyed the favours of Michael O'Hagan, while simultaneously fuelling the jealousies of Charlie Taverner. When he mentioned this other wench's likeness to Rosie, his new companion reacted with disbelief, the look on his face one which implied he thought an association between them somewhat unlikely. "She was an acquaintance of yours, sir?" "I confess I really did not know her, Rosie being of neither a shape or personality to attract me. But she was at one time the paramour of a friend." "And the possessor of the most overwhelming bosom this side of Tartary?" "The friend in question was Michael O'Hagan, and he was pressed at the same time as me." "Then sadly If he still carries a torch for Rosie, he will find his bird flown. A fact he mentioned with some regret. Aye. A farmer came in some months past from Covent Garden Market, apparently with gold in his hand and love in his heart for a wench with such massive udders, and he carted her off, no doubt to milk her. I think it was the former, the gold, which swayed your wench, for my information is that he was not overtly handsome. Charlie Taverner had also harboured designs of Rosie, and he was handsome, but that had availed him little, which made sense of Winston's observation. I reckon you are correct, sir. She was also the object of affection to another friend who lacked the means to engage her interest. So, sir, Winston said, now sat beside Pearce and his eyes full of hope. Am I to be favoured with a telling of your tale, or are the memories too painful to recount? There is a great deal to tell. Winston waved his tankard full and foaming. I have no pressing engagements. John Pearce, as he responded, felt required to mention the fact that he was a stranger to the Pelican himself, having only recently returned from Paris, which had Winston's eyebrows twitching with interest, and that required an excuse be found for why such a thing was so. He had no intention of telling a man unknown to him he had been on the run. So he concocted a tale of seeking out a French acquaintance in trouble, hinting at a woman without actually saying so, which led Winston to allude to the danger of a Briton looking for anything in such a dangerous setting as a city in the grip of the bloody revolution. Pearce deflected that by admitting to a soft heart, which protected him from exposure, and went on quickly to change a subject replete with untruths and in danger of spinning out of control. This he did by recounting the first suspicions he had that something was amiss in the Pelican, aroused by a group of tars, accompanied by a red-coated drummer boy who had come in after him and had, to his mind, acted strangely. They barely drank, Mr. Winston, and made no display, which for blue-water sailors is singular indeed. So I began to suspect something might be afoot. But before I could act upon my misgivings, the whole press gang burst in, clubs waving. I made for the side door you observed me glaring towards, narrowly avoiding a clout from our Irish friend, only to find a bastard called Ralph Barclay and more tars in possession of the alleyway. You put up a fight, for I am told there was mayhem. I very nearly got clear, sir, but they possessed numbers, and there were simply too many with whom to contest. So, once bound, I was done for. And I was not alone, of course. Those I had been conversing with previously were taken as well. You may have heard of them, too. An old wiseacre called Abel Scrivens, sadly now deceased, and another very likely also gone to meet his maker, a West Countryman called Ben Walker. He was taken by Barbary pirates, and the last I saw of him was as a wharfside slave in Tunis. The memory of that made Pearce pinch the top of his nose, his eyes shutting at the same time. Abel Scrivens had died in place of him, less than a week into that first voyage, while circumstances had forced him to leave Ben Walker to his fate, and the memory of that, mixed with a tinge of self-pity, never failed to make him slightly lachrymose. Winston was all apology. Sir, I am distressing you. It is clear. It is hard to recall them without sorrow, for if those two men resided here for crimes or misdemeanours, they did not deserve what came their way. But two of the others with whom I became companions are at present safe aboard a ship anchored off Portsmouth, very likely now joined by a third. Pearce paused then, wondering whether to mention Pitt and his promises, but he decided that would sound too fantastic to a stranger. Yet it provided a concomitant resolution. If he did not hear from Downing Street, he would have to act as if the promises made were not going to happen. Tomorrow I go first to the Admiralty to pick up for them protections, then down to Hampshire to bring them to safety. Not only will they be released from naval service, but also they will have no fear of press gangs or the crimps that line the Portsmouth Road. And these fellows are? O'Hagan. the aforementioned Charlie Taverner, and a young lad called Rufus Dommett.
Pearce raised his tankard, Arthur Winston following suit.
We called ourselves the Pelicans, a sobriquet that bound us as one. Here's to them, and to my joy that I may once again share with them a tankard in their old haunt. You must go ashore, insisted the master of HMS Fury. Matters have altered, and it has to be so. He said these words while looking up into the face of a less than enamoured Michael O'Hagan, newly back on board. Behind the master stood the purser, a thin stick of a fellow, as well as a pair of the other warrants permanently attached to the damaged frigate, the gunner and the carpenter. Clearly they saw safety in numbers when it came to dealing with the Pelicans, one of whom was still unhappy at a change of the original plan to travel with John Pearce, while not being made any more confident by the news Michael brought. You say he'll be here on the morrow, Michael, Charlie had said, and maybe he will, if in a pretty face don't take his fancy. Charlie Taverner was reminding them the same fellow had left them high and dry once before, while he pleasured himself with a high-born lady, which delayed his return from London to fetch them off another vessel, an error that saw all three of them shipped off to the Mediterranean from the very Spithead anchorage in which they were now anchored. The merchant ship from which they had been rescued, the Giscard, had been taken in by the surveyors to be valued and examined as to the legitimacy of it being a prize, the seamen with whom they had boarded her, being long-serving naval volunteers, had been happy to go with her, and, once on shore, to either contact their old captain in the hope of future employment, or to sign on in another ship of war. Charlie and Rufus, debarred from going ashore themselves, they could not just hang about in the dockyard without being attached to a vessel, and there had been nowhere else for them to reside. Since the dock at which the frigate would be fitted with new masts was occupied, another plea from Pearce to the captain for them to be allowed to stay aboard, to save money and avoid risk, had seemed the best solution. Captain Warren said we was free to stay aboard this barkie until Mr. Pearce returned. Turning to Charlie Taverner, who had mouthed that complaint, the master had his reply ready. His commission was over yesterday, and he's gone, which you have seen for yourself. But that is not the nub. This ship is to be warped in for inspection at first light tomorrow, which I admit we did not expect, and even if your officer comes, he will be too late to save you, and I'm bound to inquire if there is a risk he will be delayed. Who knows? Added the gloomy carpenter, not in the least interested in the looks of doubt exchanged by the Pelicans. She might be condemned. Her timbers are in a state after years in the Indies, and what she suffered in that hurricane we went through damaged more than just the masts. Please God she goes to the breakers, and we get a better berth, mouthed the gunner. I reckon I'm at least due a fourth rate for the years I've put in. That's not the point, the purser insisted, not in the least interested in the gunner's wish for a bigger ship and a higher rate of pay, or the carpenter's pessimism about the state of the scantlings. I have to make up my accounts for the victualling board, and I can scarce do that with you lot still eating rations as though you belong aboard, without so much as a farthing of payment. It was an impasse. Captain Warren, given his place on the captain's list, was due a larger vessel, and had been appointed to one, having got his personal followers ashore and away with him. The remainder of the crew, a high number of them Lascars, given the frigate had served on the Calcutta station, had been stripped out within an hour of Warren's departure and sent to another warship unable to weigh for want of manpower. The only reason Charlie and Rufus had been left aboard was their not being listed on the frigate's muster book. Nor was Michael. There's two ways this can be done, the master added. Either you leave, or you'll be faced by a file of marines sent to shift you ashore as soon as we tie up, with the dockyard mateys pocketing a reward for turning you in. Michael O'Hagan wanted to pick the fellow up by his throat and ask him what he thought they would do if they did go ashore without either a ticket of leave, which would stand up to scrutiny, or an officer to safeguard them. What stopped him was the man's age as well as his rank. He was not an officer in the strict sense, but he was the most senior of the warrants. To lay hands on him would not be kindly looked upon, but he did pose the question uppermost in his mind, and in a very brusque manner. "There are ways out of the dockyard, Paddy, and I can show them to you." "And then?" "Get out of Portsmouth and find your officer fellow in London." "Well, that sounds as simple as kiss my hand," crowed Charlie Taverner, his face alight with sarcasm. "We won't get over the bridge." That induced a ruminative silence. The naval base lay near the tip of Portsea Island, connected to the mainland by bridges which, quite naturally, given the propensity of sailors to desert the King's service, were well guarded for those seeking to get onto the mainland. Charlie, quite naturally, made no mention of the writs out for him and Rufus, a serious added danger. "You will if we give you a boat?" said the carpenter, suddenly, to nods from his mates when he sought their approval. "Even you make for the shore beyond Hayling Island, you'll have a clear run." The carpenter looked quizzically at the master then. He knew about maps, and he was not disappointed in the response, as the man added, "Dry land all the way, and I can draw you a route to take that will get you to London." "Easy for you to say," moaned Rufus Dommett, speaking for the first time. "You get to stay with the ship." "Which is our right, lad," the master insisted. "But we are of the sea, so you cannot think us friends to those who would press you again. For even if we are not at risk ourselves, we still despise the buggers for the low scallies they are. But you don't have a choice. It's take what's on offer, or you won't even get out onto the hard. The Marines will have all three of you aboard another bark here before your feet touch, and you can protest till you're blue that you've got protections on the way. Open your mouth to that, and they'll make sure you're on a ship about the way that very day." The implications of that were very unpleasant. Once at sea, they would be beyond the reach of legal safety, and the Navy had ways of making sure matters stayed that way. The trio exchanged glances, but in such a situation, with John Pearce absent, O'Hagan was the person to defer to. "A boat?" Michael asked eventually. "You might be best on your own, Michael," Charlie said, which got him looks of deep curiosity from the warrants. "No, we're all in the same steep tub now." If Rufus looked confused, Charlie understood. Michael was not going to desert them, seeking to use Pearce's ticket of leave that had got him here, which in any case might not suffice going the other way, given the scrutiny of such documents was intense. "The jolly boat," the gunner suggested. "Big enough for 5, and small enough so one of us can come with you to fetch it back." "Sure. We need food for the journey," said Michael. "But and more besides," Charlie added. "Some kind of shore-going rig and the like." If 3 of the men before the Pelicans nodded, 1 did not, though they all knew why Charlie had made that demand. On the way back from the Mediterranean, HMS Grampus had caught fire and sank, taking with it most of their possessions. Some had been replaced through the good offices of John Pearce, but not all. It was the 4th fellow who presented the problem. "What?" the purser demanded. "Shore-going rig? Have you not dunned me for enough?" "Mr. Pearce paid for what we're wearing," Charlie protested. "He's yet to pay for the food you're eating." "I ain't got no more'n a few pence left," O'Hagan growled, with such ferocity that the purser took 2 steps back and barged into the gunner, standing painfully on and bruising the man's toes. "And by doing what you say, we could be sacrificing any hope of what pay we're owed." "Bugger the pay," Charlie spat. "It's a 6-month wait to get that at best." "You are sure Mr. Pearce will return?" the master asked. "Course he will," shouted Charlie, with all the confidence he could muster. Any doubts he had would not be shared with this lot. "And he's well found, what with the prizes we've taken." More important was the look exchanged between the master and the purser, which implied the latter would have to accede to their request. That was until prizes were mentioned. The word brought a sudden gleam to the purser's eye, and quite suddenly he was all agreement. "I shall, of course, charge him a fee in interest, and of necessity it will be a high one, given the quality of what I will provide." Seeing Michael's glowering reaction to this promise of daylight robbery, the purser took refuge behind both the master and the gunner. Not that the statement abashed him. The other two were looking at Michael O'Hagan, and though he did not say so, the Irishman knew they were on the horns of a real dilemma. To stay was impossible. To run, fraught with peril. Never mind what they might face by being sent to sea again. Charlie and Rufus could face prison or transportation once ashore, and away from the protection provided by the Navy. As the alternatives ran quickly through his mind, he knew that what had been suggested presented the best course, and that included landing Pearce with the purser's bill. That would have to include some coin. What Pearce had given him he had used on the way south, and when he said he had only pennies left, that was the truth. Without money, they would either have to steal or beg, and that risked being quickly rumbled and handed over to the local watch, which was worse than being taken by a press gang.
"The other warrants will agree?" he asked.
The boatswain, master-at-arms, and the cook had gone ashore to carouse in the taverns of Portsmouth Point. The others, who had acted as warrants, on a ship so long at sea, had been temporary promotions by the captain, so, not being Navy board appointments, they had lost their places as soon as she dropped anchor.
"Can't see why they would not,"
the master replied.
"Food for a week, and what Charlie said besides. Some coin as well as your boat, or on the blood of the Blessed Mary. Those marines of yours will be carrying us to a new ship, and you lot in a foursome of pine boxers to the churchyard."
A huge Irish fist was slowly raised to make his point.
"Well said, Michael,"
added Charlie Taverner.
"It'd best be done peaceful like," murmured the gunner.
"Easy for you," the purser cried, recovering some of his ire. "The price is not coming from your pocket."
"Nor will it be coming from yours, you slimy goat. You'll just be giving away some of the monies you fiddled from them poor dumb lascars on the way home from Bengal."
"Take that back, or so help me."
The man stepped right up to the purser, who was by no means the shape of a fighting man, while the gunner was a short and grizzled veteran, nut-coloured from Eastern service, who had served in King's ships man and boy.
"What will you do, turd?"
"Enough," the master called. "We are not like to see these poor fellows troubled, so we has no choice but to give them what they need, without grumbling, and rely on Mr. Pearce to make good on his promise to pay." There was little time for what was required: the cutting of pigtails that had taken months to grow, the preparation of old lightweight canvas from worn sailcloth, which Michael insisted they must, with needle and thread, turn into clothing that would not only keep foul weather off their head and backs, but stop them being immediately identified as tars. The slop ducks they already wore had to be narrowed. Pigtails aside, nothing screams sailor like wide-bottomed legwear. Ditty bags were sewn too, with a skill that came easily to Rufus, once an apprentice in the leather trade, much less so to Charlie and Michael, who bled many times from needle pricks. The ditty bags had to be big enough to carry food, like chunks of portable soup, salt fish, spare shirts, stockings, lye soap, shaving kit and shore-going footwear. The work carried on into the gloom of twilight, until it was complete, and, in darkness, equipped as best they could, they went over the side, took the oars and, using the lights of the town as a guide, steered away from the dockyard along the South Sea shore to the sound of the tide beating against the shingle.
"And how in God's name," demanded Rufus Dommett, when darkness fell, "is John Pearce going to find us?"
"We have to find him, Rufus," Charlie replied, "and damn quick."
So, there you have the story, Mr. Winston. I, like the others from this benighted place, was trussed and taken downriver. The frigate weighed from Sheerness within a day. And I have to tell you that, if it is damned difficult to get off any ship, it is rendered impossible once they are at sea.
"This Ralph Barkley sounds like a rum cove, I must say," Winston said. "Not that the Navy is short of his type."
Pearce shook his head. "The pity is he is not the worst, sir. There are those who see him as lenient. Besides that, malice is endemic, for I must tell you my companions and I have been pressed not once, but twice."
Winston's eyebrows shot up. "That, sir, is singular. Am I to assume Barkley to be at the seat of that also?"
"Yes. but he had help from a slimy little toad, a midshipman and relation of his called Toby Burns.
"Who is surely worth another bumper," Winston replied, signalling for a refill. "And I am agog to hear more of this Berkeley fellow, as well as what you observed in Paris. I am a man of business, and a first-hand account of the events in that benighted city will be a rare treat indeed."
The break into French was unexpected, but it made Pearce smile.
"Voulez-vous prendre un autre bière avec moi?"
Pearce replied, amused by the less-than-perfect French, but far too polite to correct it. "Le même, s'il vous plaît." Chapter 2. It was by a fortuitous accident that John Pearce missed Ralph Berkeley at the Admiralty, for had they met, there would have been blood on the walls. True to his nature, on entering the same anteroom, Berkeley was brusque with everyone present, they being strangers. Also, given he had lost his left arm at Toulon, while making it plain the wound had yet to fully heal, the ligature left in the wound had yet to come free, his demand that a lieutenant surrender a comfortable seat on one side of the fireplace had to be acceded to, that following on from his loud admonition to the footman who had shown him in to take care to let Mr. Stevens know he came with the blessing of the Duke of Portland. It was his way of telling those waiting that he did not lack for interest in the matter of seeking employment. He was merely here to find out what ship he would be given. For all the discourtesy of his entry and manner, such was the way of the Navy, where grovelling to senior officers was very necessary. Every lieutenant present was eager to engage him in conversation, especially since, with such a potent aristocratic connection, he would soon have a command. He was, after all, a post-captain with the twin epaulets of 3 years in the rank, and he had seen action. When they inquired on such matters, they found themselves addressing a man eager to recount his adventures, as well as to air his prejudices. For the former, that led to boasts of prizes taken, a single ship action which, though ending in a defeat, he managed to make sound like a triumph. That followed by his unflattering opinion of the man who held the Mediterranean command, Vice Admiral Samuel Lord Hood.
"His lordship made a singular mess at Toulon," he insisted. "He should have listened to the wiser counsel of Sir William Hotham. Now, there was a man who had the right of it."
That had the other post-captain present, an elderly fellow who had seemed to be asleep, opening his eyes and sitting slightly forward. A man of Berkeley's rank did not lightly traduce an admiral of the status and reputation of Sam Hood without good cause. It was not necessary to say to these fellows that Ralph Berkeley was a client officer of Hotham, Lord Hood's second-in-command, or that he was unlikely to be well regarded by the C&C himself. They understood, without explanation, the nuances of what was being said, and so they should, for it was their world. If Hotham were being praised, he would be this fellow's patron. Anyone who did not have regard for Berkeley would be damned.
"And I told the noble Duke of Hood's error of judgment in no uncertain terms."
That was accompanied by a hard look to ensure they identified which particular peer he was talking about.
"I dare say Mr. Pitt has had his ears burnt already on that matter, given the government depends on support from the Portland faction to properly prosecute the war."
Explanation of necessity had to follow. Berkeley had set the scene, while underlining the depth of his own interest. Hood, he insisted, had made a bad bargain with the French in Toulon, not insisting that the royalist-leaning officers surrender the huge naval base and their ships, instead granting them the status of allies and allowing them to keep control of their powerful fleet.
"He should have seized the port, gentlemen, which was in such turmoil it could not have been defended. But did we? We should have towed out what ships we fancied and immediately burnt the rest, blocking the harbour with wrecks. But did we? We had no need to land and seek to hold the place when destruction would have served our purpose just as well."
His listeners knew these inquiries to be rhetorical, so none bothered to answer. Everyone present would have read the Naval Gazette and the London newspapers.
In short, they would be au fait with the details of the failure to hold on to Toulon, despite help from Naples, Piedmont, and Spain, with Hood landing every man he could spare from his fleet. The siege had lasted for 5 months, the forces of the French Revolution bloodily determined to take back the main French naval port in the Mediterranean. In the end, Hood had been forced to abandon the place, taking off as many refugees as he could, nowhere near the number seeking to flee the guillotine and Jacobin revenge. Thousands had died in retribution for their lack of revolutionary zeal, and, to cap it all, the destruction of those warships that could not be manned and sailed out had only been partial. In short, given sailors to crew them, the French still had a powerful fleet.
"It is said, sir," advanced a very junior lieutenant, "that the Spaniards let us down in the matter of destruction. They did not set alight those ships allotted to them."
Berkeley snorted.
"Only because an old fool who should have been beached long ago gave them opportunity to do so."
Being by nature a touch insensitive, even Ralph Berkeley could see what these fellows tried to disguise. To call into question the ability of one of the nation's best admirals was within the bounds of normal discourse. No two sailors ever entirely agreed on a command appointment or a chosen course of action. To call the same man an old fool and past it was coming it very high indeed. He had gone too far. Time, Ralph Berkeley knew, to recover some ground.
"I have nothing but admiration for Lord Hood, and I say he stands high enough in my estimation to not be shamed by comparison to the greatest naval officer it has been my privilege to serve."
The pause was just long enough to tickle their curiosity.
"I refer, of course, to Admiral Lord Rodney."
That met the stony-faced acceptance politeness demands. For once more, this captain was nailing his partisan colour to the mast. Clearly, he had previously been a client officer of the late George Bridges Rodney, an admiral about whom opinion was much divided. A great fighting sailor, yes, but a man with a reputation for being a touch free with the notion of lining his pockets, as well as playing ducks and drakes with the rules of the service. Had he not tried to make his son a post-captain aged just 12 years? Had he not raided and emptied the rich warehouses of Tortuga merely to get his hands on the value therein? It was also well known that Rodney and Sam Hood, when serving together in the Caribbean, had quarrelled a great deal. Hood insisting personal greed had proved a greater motivation to Rodney than service to his king and country.
"But age, sirs," Berkeley added with great emphasis, "has come to addle Lord Hood's thinking, as it must come to any fellow in his 8th decade. Sir William Hotham, by contrast, is still in his prime, and as clear-sighted as a man of his rank needs to be."
King George's navy was like a club, one in which gossip was the stuff of life. Indeed, John Pearce had been wont to say that no fishwife need fear comparison with a group of naval officers gathered to discuss their peers. It being their profession, they lived in its rumour-driven web, talked when they were gathered, and wrote to each other when not, while in doing so never failing to air their partialities. In the face of this piece of blatant embroidery, the gathered lieutenants murmured as if in agreement. It was the old fellow on the opposite side of the fireplace who spoke now. Being himself of equal rank, he felt no need to defer to opinions with which he did not agree.
"I had a letter from my good friend, Captain Elphinston, sir, whom I am sure you must have encountered at Toulon." "I had that good fortune, yes," Berkeley replied guardedly.
Elphinston was a creature of Hood's, and not a man he considered a friend.
"I am bound to say he was full of praise for Lord Hood, and his attempt to hold Toulon. He was also of the opinion the government had let Hood down, by not sending forth the soldiers he required, and which he asked for, and that, had they obliged, it might have been possible to inflict such a defeat of the Jacobins as to render the whole of France vulnerable. In short, to bring to an end the war. I am bound to say I respect Captain Elphinston's opinion, sir, and most markedly did so when he was my premier." "Sir," Berkeley replied, for the first time speaking guardedly, "we are not, I think, acquainted." Rawlinson.
This set Ralph Barkley thinking hard. He knew the captain's list as others know their psalms, and he searched his memory for the name. Of some 450 in total, Ralph Barkley's greatest interest was in the top of that list, to which one day he hoped he would rise. And the name, added to the man's great age, supplied the clue that fixed his position. Barkley was in the top quarter. This captain was at the very apex, and it was clear, given the determined look in his eye, the old fellow was willing to carry his disagreement all the way to argument, which might prove unpleasant. Barkley temporized.
Captain Rawlinson, I am surprised you have not yet been given your flag. I am close to that honour, sir, though it scarce credits a man to want it too much. Balderdash, Ralph Barkley thought. I want an admiral's flag more than anything in creation. Given, Captain Rawlinson continued, that it requires men of my own age or above to expire before I can be so elevated. You see, Captain Barkley, I was somewhat advanced in years when I was made post myself, but to wish for the death of others would not aid me when my own time comes. I would aspire to meet my Maker with as pure a heart as I can muster. So if I go to my grave lacking the elevation to an admiral's rank, so be it.
Your flag, sir, said that very junior lieutenant, a gleam in his eye. What a fine thing it must be. I cannot believe it is not something to be craved.
Rawlinson produced a sad smile. It is a mere title in my case, young man, since, unless I can this day persuade the board I can be of use, it will likely be a yellow pennant.
But the pay, sir, the youngster blurted out, before blushing, given it was a crude allusion. That was not the only thing to cause the kind of embarrassment that led to an avoidance of the old fellow's eye. Topping the captain's list at the next round of promotions, he would get a rear admiral's rank and the rise in pay that went with it, a stipend he would hold till the day he died. But yellow admirals were granted no command. The Navy took great care to ensure the competence of those granted control of its fleets, and it required influence to be granted any of the other numerous appointments in the Admiralty gift. The conclusion was plain. As an officer, Captain Rawlinson had probably pursued an undistinguished career. In that time he had failed to make important connections in the service or politics, and, while no doubt competent, did not impress those who ran the Navy with his powers of command. If it was not an uncommon state of affairs, there were many more yellow admirals than active ones, just as there were more captains than vessels for them to command. It was rare to have it openly stated. Yet I have hope, Rawlinson added, with a wan smile, that I might be gainfully employed in some capacity. Hence my presence here among we supplicants. Ralph Barkley was about to protest he was better than a mere supplicant, when the footman intoned his name from the doorway, adding, Admiral Gardner will see you now. Barkley nodded happily as he rose to exit. He was about to see the most senior of the present naval lords, Hood the other being absent. Added to that, Alan Gardner, in charge of appointments to ships, had been a client of Rodney, so he was assured of a warm reception. The same words made old Rawlinson sigh and recline once more in his chair, eyes closing, as they had been when Barkley first entered the room. He had been passed over yet again, underlining just how low were his chances of success.
End of CD 1. CD 2.
Midshipman Toby Burns had decided some time past that Admiral Sir William Hotham was trying to get him killed by continually putting him in danger. The reason was clear even to dim Toby, who was not well blessed in the article of discernment, and it all had to do with his uncle by marriage, Captain Ralph Barkley. In a piece of chicanery to which Hotham had been an active accomplice, a charge of illegal impressment brought by the pestilential John Pearce had been seen off by a farce of a court-martial held in Toulon, undertaken when the main litigants and their damning evidence were safely out of the way, en route to the Bay of Biscay. Serving aboard his uncle's frigate, and in utter terror of the man, Toby Burns had become the chief witness, primed to lie through his teeth that he had been present at the taking of John Pearce and his stupidly named Pelicans, when in fact he had been nowhere near the liberties of the Savoy on the night in question. Hotham had seen to it that none of the contrary written depositions were introduced, and had staffed the court with officers he could trust, both in the presentation of the evidence and in the concluding judgment. Ralph Barclay had thus suffered nothing more than a mild rebuke. Such an outcome had not brought the youngster security. Quite the opposite. Now, serving in Hotham's flagship, HMS Britannia, and apparently much cosseted by the Admiral, his fellow midshipmen, though never in his hearing, called him the Admiral's bum boy, he had been sent more than once on the excuse of providing him with opportunity to distinguish himself into deadly situations, the irony being that those with whom he now shared his shipboard accommodation were ravaged with jealousy at what they saw as his good fortune. In Toulon, he had faced death or mutilation in the action in which his uncle had lost his arm. At San Fiorenzo, the most northern anchorage in Corsica, Hotham had selected him to help lead ashore the boats carrying the Marines to the beach, and there he had seen his superior, a lieutenant, end up with a smashed leg. Now he was on a land expedition, and had spent the last 3 days trudging up and through the Teghim Pass, still in the grip of winter, cold and snowbound at this altitude, as part of the so-called liaison with the troops of General Dundas, seeking to take the French town of Bastia, helping to haul the naval cannon provided to aid the assault. From San Fiorenzo to Bastia was no great distance as the crow flies, but the pave road ran through high mountains, and the upward leg had been hellish. At least now they were on the downward slopes, heading for the coast on which the city lay. It was fully expected this was the day they would meet the enemy, and, unable to sleep, the youngster was awaiting the dawn with trepidation. Sat by a blazing fire, his cloak wrapped tightly around him and staring into the flames, he had taken to listing those people whom he saw as inimical to his well-being. One that seemed to grow longer the more he considered the matter. Hotham, Ralph Barclay, and John Pearce only headed the growing roll, which extended in his present mood to include his own family, who had failed to see on his last visit home that he did not want to be in the Navy at all, never mind stuck halfway up a mountain pass with a party of seamen who showed him scant respect. In order to hold that view, it was, of course, very necessary for him to forget his one-time enthusiasm for sea service, the way he had persuaded his parents to badger a newly acquired uncle, Ralph Barclay had married his Aunt Emily, to give him a place in his midshipman's berth. What a shock that had been. There was no romance below decks on a man-o'-war, no glory. There was filth, thievery, bullying of a kind he had hoped to have left behind when he departed his school, added to a severe risk of being maimed or killed in action, the first of which had seen him wrecked on the shores of France. He had returned to Somerset after only a few months of service as a supposed hero, finding it impossible under such a burden to let those so proud of him know of either his unpleasant experiences or of his very real fears. "Not asleep, Mr. Burns? Surely you of all people have no dread of action today." The voice of Lieutenant Driffield had him shoot to his feet. The fellow might only be a marine officer, but he was in all respects his superior. What followed was an emollient apology for so startling him. "Please, young fellow, there's no need to jump to attention. We are, after all, in the field."
"You caught me deep in thought, sir."
"I dare say you were plotting ways to confound the enemy."
"Of course, sir,"
Burns replied automatically, as Driffield stood rubbing and warming his hands. "Well, never fear. You will soon have action to get your blood flowing. I have asked permission of the bullocks that my marines and I be allowed to partake of any assaults on the enemy bastions blocking the road to Bastia. No point in coming all this way and not seeing action, what? Be assured, should you wish to accompany me, I would be honoured to include you, and I know my men would be inspired by your presence." Having turned away from the fire, the cold air helped to fix the features on Toby Burns's face, which enabled him to avoid reacting to this terrifying hyperbole. The last thing he wanted was to partake. He did not want to even be where he was now. His heart's desire, which he feared to articulate, was to be back in rural Somerset, and even at school, perhaps applying himself in a way he had not done previously to his books, so as to qualify for an occupation that would keep him safely ashore, perhaps as a curate or an articled clerk of law. "Sit down, Mr. Burns," Driffield insisted, doing so himself. There was a short pause before the Marine lieutenant spoke again, and it was with a sideways glance at the midshipman. "I know, young sir, for I have been told that you are reticent in the matter of your exploits, modest to a fault, in fact. But here we are, with dawn not yet upon us and with time to kill. If it would not put you out at all, it would pass some of that if you were to entertain me with the tale of your heroics. I refer, of course, to the events in Brittany." Staring into the flames again, Toby Burns was thinking if Jesus Christ had his Calvary, he was not alone. Brittany, and what happened there, was his. The whole exploit, just like his supposed heroism, was founded on a lie, and one he feared would eventually be exposed. But he was not going to be the source of that. Obliged many times to repeat the untruths and seeming trapped into doing so now, the words came with an ease born of much repetition, larded, of course, with very necessary modesty regarding his own role. No matter how many times he told the story, it provided for him no crumbs of personal comfort. "It will not surprise you, sir, that naval officers are sometimes lacking in the very basic needs of their profession." Driffield nodded at that, perhaps a trifle too enthusiastically, Marine officers being much condescended to by their naval counterparts. "In Lieutenant Hale of HMS Brilliant, we had one who was not only deficient in that, but deaf to boot, and it was because of his affliction, his inability to hear the heavy crashing of waves on jagged rocks, we found ourselves cast ashore on the French coast, lucky not to be drowned in the maelstrom." The tale rolled out, of Hale drowning, he being the only bluecoat to survive, and because of his midshipman status, in charge of a party of bone-headed seamen, he was forced, despite being a mere 13 years of age, to take command, to concoct a plan to get back aboard his Uncle Ralph's frigate. As he spoke, to a silent and admiring marine, the sky took on a grey tinge, slate rather than any hint of blue, and soon all around them under the heavy clouds, bugles blew and soldiers stirred from their tents to begin to heat their breakfast. Both men by the fire brought theirs by Driffield's servant. By the time Toby Burns, in his story, had got back to England, to be hailed as the first hero of the new war, the trumpets were starting to blow for the troops to assemble, so he was spared the need to recount the way his family had reacted to his supposed success, had failed to discern what he couldn't bring himself to tell them, his desire to forego sea service. "A fine tale, Mr. Burns, and one you should be more than proud to relate. It says something for a boy of your years, as well as for the service of which we are both a part, that you should be able to command men so much older. I'm surprised you did not have a mutiny on your hands when you ordered them to risk their lives." "John Pearce would have started one." "Pearce?" asked Driffield. Toby realised he was weary, from worry as well as lack of sleep, that being a name he was not inclined to utter in another's hearing, of a man who had become the bane of his entire life since the events he had just been describing. It was John Pearce who had taken command, not he. Pearce who had shown the leadership and skills he so conspicuously lacked, details of which his Uncle Ralph had suppressed. But he was obliged to respond, given the look on the Marine lieutenant's face. "A sailor who was one of the party I commanded, sir, and a true sea lawyer type." "I met a fellow of that name at Toulon. A naval lieutenant." "Different fellow, I'm sure," Toby Burns replied quickly, standing up to cover the blush of his lie. He had spent his entire time in Toulon seeking to avoid that very person, on the very good grounds that not only had he stolen the man's glory, he had, on the way back to England, watched him pressed a second time, when he could easily have intervened to prevent it. "Must be another person," Driffield agreed. rising also. "But if they share a name, young sir, they share other traits. The Pearce I met was a very wrong-headed fellow. He wanted me to abandon my guns to the enemy, damn him." "Shocking," Toby Burns exclaimed, seeing it in the expression of his companion as the required response. Driffield puffed himself up to his full height, then, pushing out the buttons on his red coat, "I confounded him, of course, and the enemy. Waited till he had scuttled off and did my proper duty." "You must be very proud, sir." Driffield's reply was quite sharp, considering how friendly it had been hitherto. "As I said, Mr. Burns, I did my duty. No more, no less." In a long line the column descended from the pass of Tegim, the ground underfoot on the switchback road turning from frozen slush to the more slippery brown-flecked kind, and finally to nothing but mud. But at least going downhill the oxen were not straining, the only hold-up caused by wheels dropping into the ruts of a poorly maintained surface. They could see at times to their right, at others to their left, the Mediterranean, not blue, but as grey as the sky it reflected, and between them and it the lower hills that hogged the coast where their enemies awaited them. That sight was soon lost once they descended further. Above and below the sides of the roadway thick forests of pine, oak, chestnut and beech hemmed them in, and where there was a clear path the earth was terraced, red and rock-filled, with straggling vineyards or olive groves, only very occasionally showing a peasant dwelling, one which was immediately raided by the soldiers. They emerged with whatever of value they could steal, not much from inhabitants who had fled, as country folk do at the approach of any force, hostile or friendly, taking their livestock, sheep and goats with them. On the lower slopes there were fewer trees, but instead they had to contend with the thick, near-impenetrable scrub that was a special feature of the island. Up ahead there was the occasional rattle of musketry as French skirmishers, using the dense undergrowth, sought to delay the column's progress. "Pinpricks," Driffield called them, though in time they passed one of the fatal results, a red-coated body by the roadside, which did nothing for the state of Toby Burns's mind. Boots covered in mud, white breeches likewise spattered, the bottom of his cloak soaked. He lumbered along, occasionally issuing unnecessary commands to men who knew better than he what to do, receiving in return barely disguised looks of dislike covered by touched forelocks. Here was another reason to detest the King's Navy. Tars were generally indulgent of young midshipmen. He had seen it often enough. Sometimes, it was true, they joshed them into making fools of themselves, sending them to get things like skyhooks and long weights. But it was done, if not with pure kindness, with little malice. No sailor he had served with ever played upon him, benevolently or otherwise. They either ignored him or sought to thwart him in some way. So gloomy had he become, he even contemplated the thought that death would be preferable to his present cold condition. Not a painful one, of course, but a demise of the kind where one goes to sleep and merely does not awake. That was until he considered divine retribution. Yet surely his lies would not count against him in the eyes of the Lord. Forces with which he could not contend had pressed them upon him, so the sin was surely theirs. His uncle Ralph had known very well it was John Pearce who had led the party that recaptured the ship taken from his convoy. He who had sent him back to England with the dispatch extolling his heroism. He had also inveigled him into telling lies at the court-martial that had dished Pearce's hopes of retribution, aided, of course, by that sly old bastard Hotham. No, he was an innocent in all this. Should he expire in his sleep, surely he would not be denied celestial comfort, a place in heaven, for what were the transgressions of others. That he had not confessed them either in church or in life was not allowed to interfere with the outcome the youngster mentally desired. It was unfortunate, then, that in contemplation one of the faces to fill his mind was that of his Aunt Emily, estranged wife of his uncle, and the one person who, in knowing the truth of what had happened, and being of a pure nature, might one day ditch him. She had gone back to England with her wounded husband. Was she at this moment relating to his family the terrible lies he had told? The thought, which he tried to get out of his mind, would not go, making his misery even more acute. Silently, he imagined a prayer to send over the ocean to her, begging forgiveness, but more than that, her silence. Chapter 3. Ensconced in a decent set of rooms just off Holborn, near the Inns of Court, her chest unpacked and her possessions put away, Emily Barclay had achieved that which she sought, the freedom to live as she wished without her marital vows impinging on her life. The note from her husband demanding she return to the family home she ignored, merely replying in the negative, but suggesting he meet her on neutral ground to work out how they were to find a way of living as a married couple while never sharing the same roof, with the concomitant need to avoid a scandal that would harm Ralph Barclay's career, necessary to support them both financially, and destroy her reputation. That it would require care by both parties was a given. The world in which they lived did not take kindly to separation or anything that fractured the marriage vows, so it was incumbent on Emily to somehow protect her estranged husband, to find a fiction that society would see as acceptable. Not that anyone with half a brain would be fooled, but appearances were all. If he had a ship and was at sea, pursuing his career, matters would be eased. Should he fail to find employment, a strong possibility given his missing arm, then things would be much more complex. She reflected less now on how she could have been so blind to Ralph Barclay's manifest faults. Of course, she was junior to him by 20 years. He was a naval captain, and even lacking a ship was thus seen as a catch. There had also been a degree of parental pressure, due to the fact that the home into which she had been born and raised was entailed to the Barclay family, and, due to death and inheritance, had he so chosen, Captain Barclay could have turfed them out and not been required to give a reason for doing so. With an ineffectual father and a single-minded mother, the drift from intention to engagement, then to nuptials, had turned out, when she examined it in retrospect, to be seamless. How supine she had been. It was not hard for her to pin down the exact moment when that had been punctured and her spirit hardened. There had been that first day at Sheerness, aboard HMS Brilliant, when, following on from her own arrival, had come those poor unfortunates her husband called volunteers, when she more than suspected, by their bruised and dispirited appearance, they were pressed men. Then he had hit the one called John Pearce for the mere act of looking at her. She had not known his name then, of course. But how much that man had impacted on her life since that first day. Her husband's determination to subsequently flog him for a minor misdemeanor had led to their first disagreement, and it had seemed the relationship went downhill from that moment, culminating in his lies about not meeting Pearce while she and Captain Barclay were prisoners in Toulon. The tap at the door took her mind off both, and she opened it to find her widowed landlady, Mrs. Fletcher, waiting to speak.
"A gentleman to see you, Mrs. Barclay."
"In uniform?" Emily asked, suspecting it might be her husband, even if she had demanded he do not call.
"No," she simpered. "An engaging young fellow, and very handsome he is too, waiting for you in the parlour."
Her heart had lifted at the thought it might be Heinrich Lutchens, to whom she had sent a note regarding her new address, but there was no way the one-time surgeon of HMS Brilliant, who had become her sounding board and many times acted as her conscience over this past year, could be described as handsome.
"No name?" "He did not give one, but he says he carries an important message."
"Handsome, you say?" The way Mrs. Fletcher responded positively to that, almost coquettish, gave Emily a clue to who it might be, and if she was correct in her assumption, she knew she would have to steel herself for what was coming, given it was bound to be unpleasant. "I will come down presently." When Mrs. Fletcher left, Emily went to a chest of drawers and opened it, the scent of the perfumed liners rising to her nose. The papers she wanted were not hidden in any way, and, Taking them out, she unfolded and looked through the bundle. A copy she had made on the way to London, even though she knew very well what each page said. Selecting the one she thought the most damning, the bundle was returned to the drawer, yet she shuddered as she closed it. Much as you anticipate a confrontation, and even when you know you hold all the cards, there is always a moment of anxiety. For all the certainties, matters might not go as you wish. He was standing, back to the door, looking out onto the street when Emily entered the room. But she knew, by the corn-coloured nature of his hair, even before he turned to face her. It was, as she had suspected, her husband's clerk, Cornelius Gerson. The smile was the same one she recalled from previous encounters, a look that implied an amorous connection and an intimacy which certainly did not exist. If there was one man in the world she loathed without a measure of charity, it was this slimy toad.
Mrs. Berkeley, I come from your husband.
He still employs you?
He will have need of me when he gets his next command.
There was an attempt to keep anticipation out of her voice.
There is some hope of that, then?
Gerson's smirk told her she had failed. It was as if he could see the workings of her mind.
He has made some very important connections of late. Enough, I suspect, to get him a ship of the line. He had a very favourable interview this very day at the Admiralty.
And the messages?
Simply that he declines to support you in your desire for independence.
The fact that Emily smiled threw Gerson only very slightly.
He does not consider I can support myself?
The look she got then, for there was one obvious way she could do that, was interesting.
He requires you to return to the marital home, his home, where he will join you at his convenience. He also bids me to point out to you that there are consequences attendant upon a refusal that encompass more than your own person. I refer, of course, to the remainder of your family.
How typical of Captain Berkeley to use the innocent to seek to punish those he sees as guilty.
Then you admit guilt?
If I am guilty of anything, it is in being slow to see what a slug I married.
Is that a word you would wish me to convey to him?
I asked Captain Berkeley to meet me on neutral ground. Am I to assume he declines that also?
Gerson nodded.
Then much as it displeases me to deal with you...
Gerson's look was a picture. He was so vain with his absurdly handsome face and near girlish features, he could not accept even now, and after all the times he had faced her angry rejections, that Emily was not in the least bit attracted to him. No doubt he had contemplated, after her previous words, that he might keep her himself as a mistress.
Take that smirk off your face, you snake.
He was not thrown.
You call me a snake, madam?
Physician, heal thyself. I say, for like Eve, it is you who are the betrayer. It is a fault of your sex, as I know only too well from having dealt with many women myself. Fists clenched, Emily fought the desire to dispute with him. It would not serve. Instead, she held out the paper she had brought from upstairs.
I will not give this into your hand. Since my trust in you is so low, I have no knowledge of how you would use it. Probably to blackmail my husband, not to aid him. But you may come closer and look.
He declined to move. What can a piece of paper tell me?
This is a fair copy of part of a transcript of my husband's court-martial, which both you and I know to have been a tissue of concocted lies and perjured testimony before a court hand-picked by Sir William Hotham. It is taken from the original sent to Lord Hood for his confirmation of sentence, and it is part of the testimony given by my nephew, Toby.
He had moved closer as she spoke, to stare at the paper she was holding out. Her handwriting was neat and copperplate, so easy to read.
You will wonder how I came by such a thing, and you may do so till hell freezes over, for I will keep my counsel. But I have the court record in its entirety in my possession, and safe. Should my husband fail to support me, these papers will be placed in hands that will see Captain Berkeley, and for all I know, you with him, had up for blatant perjury. I shall also write to Admiral Hotham to let him know what I am about to do, and he is not a man to suffer disgrace. I dare say any threat to his reputation will see him throw you all to the wolves."
Gearson was not smiling now. He had on his face a pout that would not have shamed a child denied a sweetmeat.
"Tell my husband to accede to my request for a meeting. Mrs. Fletcher will show you out."
"I don't believe you, madam. You were present at the court-martial. These must be notes you made, which renders them useless, since you cannot testify against your husband or proffer evidence against him."
"Gearson, I do not care if you believe me or not. You are of no account. Good day."
"Your nephew will suffer most, madam, which in turn will bring shame on your whole family." That was a telling barb, but she knew Toby Burns to be a liar and a coward, knew he had stolen, with her husband's contrivance, Pearce's achievements in Brittany. Any disgrace would break the hearts of her aunt and uncle, and she had considered the matter before.
"Toby has made his own bed, and so must lie on it," she replied,
well aware that it was far from being that simple. A bed that might well be Botany Bay.
"You may face the same fate."
"No, Mrs. Barclay," Gearson replied, with such annoying and resurgent confidence. "I committed no words to the court that could in any way be questioned by another, Pearce notwithstanding, which leaves it as his word against mine."
"I am sure you have other crimes that will one day see you transported. Now get out."
The slow, elegant bow was infuriating. Emily was shaking by the time she got back to her rooms, thankful that she had not succumbed to that in Gearson's presence, well aware the snake had spotted the flaw in her proposition. She could not ditch her husband without also ditching her nephew, who had been the chief court-martial witness. Could she pay that price? Would she write to him and give him a chance to repent? And if she did, and he agreed, how would that affect her future life? Midday found Toby Burns on the steep coastal hills of East Corsica, which ran right down to the sea, creating valleys of varying depth, with the leaders of the army, General Dundas and Colonel Stewart, eyeing the first of the enemy positions through their spyglasses, a redoubt with half a dozen cannon covering the sloping intervening ground. Beyond that, in the distance, hugging the shore, lay Bastia, with the sticks of ships' masts, if not the hulls, visible in the harbour. The old fishing town was between them and the citadel, which protected that anchorage, the white walls of which, even without the magnification of a telescope, looked pretty formidable. That was underlined by the layered defences which had been set up in between. The French had known they were coming, and had made their preparations accordingly. They intended to exact a high price from their enemy before they could even think of closing the harbour and investing the city. From 50 yards distance, Toby Burns observed the negative shakes of the head and a degree of heated discussion. These army officers were seemingly not enamoured of their prospects, which suited him admirably. Uncomfortable as it would be, he would happily recross the mountains without another shot being fired. Driffield was closer, within earshot of the discussions, and it was not long before he came striding towards the midshipman, his face angry. "Damn these bullocks! They are a shy lot."
"How so, sir?"
"They say that what lies before us is too formidable to assault with the forces we have, and even if we could subdue the outworks, they lack the means to lay siege to the city."
"So we pull back?" Toby asked, careful to sound disappointed.
"After a demonstration, I think, yes."
"Demonstration?"
"We cannot just retire with our tail between our legs, Mr. Burns, without showing Johnny Crapo our mettle. I dare say Dundas and Stewart will be satisfied to subdue that redoubt before us. It hardly serves, to my mind."
"What would satisfy you, Mr. Driffield?"
"Why, Mr. Burns, that you and I show them what our service is made of, by beating our weapons on their city walls. Rest assured, if they do decide to attack those guns, you and I will be well to the fore. The Navy will take a cannon this day, or we will expire in the effort. So get yourself 2 prime pistols and a sharp blade, while I get my Marines ready."
"And the sailors, sir?"
"No tars. This is a task for lobsters." Driffield grinned then. "And, of course, midshipmen of the right stripe."
Much time was taken up getting the British artillery into position and firing, seeking to subdue the enemy by destroying their outworks, with the obvious concomitant that they were within range of counter-battery fire. It was a damn dangerous place to be, but Toby Burns had no choice, and it was just as well, given his ignorance. He had no need to issue orders regarding range and powder. The gunner's mate sent along saw to that. For quite apart from his lack of knowledge, he would not have trusted his voice to emerge as anything other than a squeak. Driffield, on the other naval cannon, could not shut up, issuing a constant stream of bellowed encouragement to "Give them hell, lads!" and "Let us see the true colour of their damn claret!" Meanwhile, the assault parties were forming up, half the available force, officers dressing lines so that their men would not disgrace them by risking their lives in an untidy fashion. Then came the moment Toby dreaded most, when Driffield called to him, gleefully ordering his own men, who had been working their cannon in shirt-sleeves, to don their redcoats, gather their muskets, fix bayonets, and take a heavy tot of the soldiers' rum to still their gut. On the marine officer's heels, Toby, the taste of that rum still burning in his throat, was close enough to the major leading the assault to hear the idiot marine thanking him for the chance to face a glorious death. As the drum started beating, the youngster had to work hard to keep his bowels from issuing an involuntary evacuation. But the terror of exposure had him marching forward as the command was given. They passed the mouth of the naval cannon to a last salvo, followed by loud cheers, with the grinning faces of the tars full of encouragement. For the first time in his naval career, the midshipman issued a command that was stern enough to be immediately obeyed. "Belay that damn noise!" "Do not castigate them for encouragement, Mr. Burns," Driffield called, "for it is only engendered by jealousy. They, I am sure, would wish to be alongside us." The first French ball scythed into the centre of the long, thin line of redcoats and took with it 2 bullocks, the ranks closing up automatically to fill the space, the eyes of the men Toby Burns could see staring straight ahead, fixed upon their object, with he wondering how they could act so and ignore the bloody corpses of their fallen mates. "Grape soon," Driffield said, out of the side of his mouth, as if he was about to be in receipt of a surprise and welcome gift. "We will charge after the first salvo, I'll wager." That grape shot came as if ordered, the tiny steel balls cracking as they passed Toby's ears. His first thought was to fall to the ground as if wounded, but having already employed that bit of subterfuge in a similar attack on the heights of Toulon, he had severe doubts as to its serving a second time. In one hand he had a loaded pistol, in the other a raised sword, heavy enough to make his young arm ache, and all his thoughts were on how to employ those weapons on himself, not the enemy. Yet if he was afraid of the pain of a wound inflicted by others, he was even more fearful of one made by his own hand. He had, he knew, begun to cry, the tears streaming down his face, his mind in a turmoil of thoughts and emotions, saved from discovery by the sudden command to charge, which allowed him to be dilatory and let those alongside him get slightly ahead. By sidestepping, he got himself behind 2 bulky fellows. Soldiers or marines, it made no odds. They were taller than he, and that sufficed. If a ball came his way, they would take it first. Thankfully, Driffield had lost all interest in his hero midshipman, his own lust for glory consuming his being. He was yelling and waving his sword like a banshee, and right before him lay the damaged earthworks of the enemy redoubt, still firing grape as well as supporting musket fire. Which one of those weapons took him in the chest mattered little. He stopped as if struck by a plank of wood, his body going rigid and seeming to rise from the ground, his weapons in the air as if he was aiming them at the heavens, his black tricorn hat flying backwards and off his head. Then he crumpled, collapsing, not falling, first to his knees and then sideways to the ground. Toby Burns was beside him, kneeling, glad of the chance to stop going forward, looking into the still open eyes.
"Do not attend to me, Mr. Burns," he gasped. "Lead my lobsters to victory."
It was a relief to Toby Burns that Driffield's eyes closed then, that a stream of bright red froth burst between his lips, accompanied by a deep groan. With the man down, Toby did not have to go any further forward, and from his kneeling position he could see that the redcoats were atop the earthwork, taking aim with muskets at what must be a fleeing enemy. He had survived. The counterstroke was not long in coming. No sooner had the defenders abandoned the redoubt than those who had taken it were in receipt of musketry from their inland flank, a party of French infantry firing from the deep scrub and woods above them, those crowing their victory on the crown of the embankment, taking the most punishment, with Colonel Stewart, who had led the attack, calling to them urgently to get down. From being a defensive position that had protected the French, it now became one behind which the redcoats cowered, with Stewart, foolishly exposed, spyglass to his eye, seeking to assess what threat they faced, which, given the swing of that tiny telescope, seemed to be coming from more than one direction. Toby, having run for that same shelter, was right by his legs as he spoke. "Humbugged, by damn!" Then the movement at his feet caught his eye, and he barked, "Stand up, sir! Do not let the men you lead see you cower!" "Mr. Driffield is dead, sir," Toby protested, as a knot of other officers joined their colonel. "All the more reason for you to appear unconcerned, lad." He had no choice but to comply, not least because what officers remained had come to join their colonel. Faint over the ground behind him, Toby could hear shouted commands. A glance backwards showed the remainder of the British force forming up, their lines being dressed once more for tidiness. He could also see the guns being levered round to take a new aim. "They are coming to our rescue, sir," he cried. "Damn me, I hope not," Charles Stewart said, with a wry grin, as several musket balls cracked over Toby's head and by the ears of the gathered officers. "But they will cover us as we seek to retire. Mr. Burns, I know you to be a brave lad, Mr. Driffield told me. So get your lobsters formed up and ensure they have their muskets loaded. I am in no doubt you are aware of what is required, but I will tell you anyway. They must follow my orders as to when to deliver a volley, and then retire at a walk so they can reload on the move. I anticipate the French will pursue, so I will require them to stop on my command and fire again, then repeat the manoeuvre." "Sir." "See to it, lad. We're short on time. Gentlemen, to your places." Approaching the Marine party, Toby was aware that it was not only Driffield's body lying out in the open. From a detachment of 20, they were down to 14. It was an absurd thought to have at such a time, as he counted their number, to see there was one for every year of his age. With a tremulous note in his voice, he issued his orders to a corporal, who looked as if he understood, though there was a definite scowl attached to his acknowledgment for having to take instruction from such a nipper. "Follow Colonel Stewart in all things. I will issue no more commands." "Praise be," came a growling voice from behind the corporal, who issued a weary, insincere reprimand. The British cannon opened up, and that was the signal for which Stewart had been waiting. In a parade-ground voice, he ordered his men to form up. His next command, as they complied, to give the French a volley. Then they spun and began to walk with their backs exposed to enemy musketry, each man holding his weapon as he first cleaned it, tore open a charge, poured powder down the barrel, followed by a rammed-in ball, the last act being the priming of the pan, then the response, stopping, turning, aiming and firing as ordered, then continuing the orderly retreat. It would have been admirable to see it, if Toby Burns had looked, a demonstration of the tight discipline and training of the British redcoat. He was not watching. He had his eyes firmly on the ground before his feet, his shoulders hunched for what he knew was coming. The searing feeling in his arm was not pain, more like that which you feel when inadvertently touching a very hot griddle, but a look to the side showed his blue coat ripped and the first sign of blood beginning to emerge through his equally damaged shirt. He fell to his knees, part in shock, part in the thought that he would be less of a target, with the notion of being taken prisoner suddenly attracting him. "On your feet, Mr. Burns," Stewart called over the sound of both cannon and musket fire, "lest you favour the notion of a French bayonet in your vitals, for they will not take captives, I'll wager." Toby Burns was up and running in a flash, getting ahead of the line until another shout slowed him. The whole body of British forces, once reunited, effected an untidy disengagement, guns being hauled away ahead of the infantry, until they were on the route back up to the pass of Tegim, one so narrow the French declined to enter in pursuit. A hastily bandaged midshipman was with them, head held high now, feeling for once like a true hero, issuing, much to the annoyance of his toiling tars and very likely the struggling oxen as well, brusque orders which did nothing to aid the task of getting those heavy cannon up the steep hill. Chapter 4. Pearce had entertained Winston regarding his sojourn in Paris, before going on to describe serving under Ralph Barclay, and that had naturally led on to the story of his adventures in Brittany, which then required him to recount the events of the second impressment at sea of him and his friends, thanks to the supine nature of Toby Burns. This, over a tankard of ale, it was his turn to provide. Winston was a good listener, rarely interrupting unless he required clarification, but he did inquire what it was like to be flogged. "Not, sir, that I am a stranger to punishment, given I was a pupil at Eton, where the masters were hearty with the birch. One, I admit, before my time, flogged 40 boys in one day, which, given the strain on the swinging arm, is prodigious."
"It is said to make a good man bad, and a bad man worse. So what it does to mere boys, I cannot imagine."
"But would it not also be true to say that in certain settings, even a school, discipline is very necessary?"
"Command is very necessary, sir. But I have had charge of a ship, albeit not a large vessel, and for a very short period. A basilisk eye and a threat to stop grog will serve just as well as the lash, excepting, of course, the endemic hard bargain, who might require to be stapled to the deck. But you must understand that flogging at sea is ritualistic in its execution, as much a demonstration of the power to punish as the actual act of punishment itself. So it is often not about chastisement, but the glorification of the office of ship's captain." Thinking back to what had happened to him, almost a piece of theatre in its undertones, John Pearce felt it necessary to add to his explanation. "Having said that, it is also the case that the crew of king's ships tend to an appreciation of what constitutes fair play, and have thus devised their own methods, as long as they are not dealing with an outright martinet, of mitigating the actual pain inflicted."
"Mr. Pearce, you have been most forthcoming, and damned entertaining, and no man could question you have had an interesting life. But you mention you held a command, so you must tell me how you came by, in such a short service at sea, that blue coat." 2 tankards of porter added to the metheglin had tended to soften John Pearce's natural modesty, so there was just a trace of swank in the way he replied,
"Have you heard of a French capture called the Valmy?"
"Who has not? It had the church bells pealing," Winston said, before keenly looking at Pearce.
"Was you the fellow who took her?" "I played a small part in her capture, yes, and it was much exaggerated in the telling."
"Yet profitable, I imagine."
"No. I was dunned out of my true share of the proceeds, getting pennies, not pounds. But my actions impressed Farmer George. The old booby insisted I be given promotion from midshipman to lieutenant."
Pearce took a deep swallow.
"Wasted, I might add, since I have no intention of any further service to him or his damned navy."
"I don't follow."
"I would not accept another commission, sir, though I am forced to admit there is no great queue waiting to grant me one."
"The navy presents great opportunities in war, sir."
"That may be true, Mr. Winston, but not for me."
"Then I am forced to inquire, sir, what occupation will you follow?"
"That is yet to be decided. My main concern at present, protection secured, is to find a means to bring the aforementioned Captain Barclay before a court."
"If it is for illegal impressment, sir, you will struggle, for the tars are good at minding their own. A seaman was killed not 6 months past in the Thames estuary by a boarding party intent on pressing seamen. Yet with the Admiralty fielding its full power in the court, the lieutenant in charge was acquitted even of manslaughter, when he was clearly guilty of murder, he having given the order to fire the muskets, admittedly in reply to one being set off from the ship."
"I have a possibility of getting him met with a charge of perjury."
"Perjury, by damn!
Do I detect the beginning of another tale, sir?"
Pearce smiled.
"I think, sir, I have assailed your patience enough."
Winston signalled to the serving girl.
"Another will do no harm, and it is my turn to provide it."
And neither did it harm him as Pearce recounted the details of the travesty of Berkeley's court-martial, of how he and the true witnesses had been sidelined. He went on to explain the need for evidence, declining to say the pure, unvarnished proof was lost because of a fire at sea. Winston was quick to allude to the expense.
"There is not a lawyer in creation, sir, who will not rub his hands at such a brief, for deep pockets will be needed, and they are masters at the stripping out of wealth from their clients."
"True," Pearce replied, draining his ale. "But if I can get a certain midshipman back from service in the Mediterranean, the aforementioned Burns, who was most avowedly not, as he claimed there on the night I was pressed, I will have Ralph Berkeley regardless. Now, I must finish my drink and be on my way, sir."
"Before you depart, Lieutenant Pearce."
"I think Mr. Pearce might suffice from the morrow, for once I have collected from the Admiralty the protections for my friends, I may discard this blue coat forever."
"Yet you have experience of being at sea."
Pearce laughed, an act made more hearty by the consumption of porter.
"Not a great deal, sir. From your own lips you have admitted to commanding a vessel. What I mean to say, sir, is my line of business occasionally includes the need to ship goods by sea, mostly in the coastal trade. And I must tell you the war with France makes more difficult what was never easy. In short, finding reliable people who will do what I need done, and properly."
"It is very kind of you, Mr. Winston, but I shall be wholly occupied for some time in getting Captain Berkeley into a court of law."
"Nevertheless, you must, I suspect, find some form of employment in the future."
Winston reached inside his coat and produced a small rectangular card.
"Upon this, sir, are my details, where I can be found, though I would add I am generally there only in the mornings. Should your needs, not least the lawyer's fees, require you to seek out a way to make your way, then let your feet direct you to my door, where you will be most welcome."
"That is most obliging of you, Mr. Winston, but I am not without means. I am off to see the fellow who represents me in the article of prizes, where I will discover how I am found in the nature of funds. That is one measure of how soon I can proceed with the matter Berkeley."
"You took prizes?"
Winston asked, with a slight air of disappointment.
"I was most fortunate in that regard, yes.
One in the Mediterranean, and another on my way home."
"Valuable, I suspect, this time."
"If all is well, I should be able to easily sustain my own needs, and perhaps have enough to bring my case." Winston nodded slowly, then seemed to recover both himself and his winning smile.
"Then it only remains for me to wish you well, sir."
"Perhaps we will meet again."
"Perhaps, Mr. Pearce."
The offices of Alexander Davidson were in Harper Street, on the opposite side of Holborn to the lawyer's chambers of Gray's Inn. He was a man who lived above the shop, his home being on the upper floors of what was a narrow but handsome townhouse. Thus, the lateness of the hour—it was dark by the time John Pearce called—had no bearing. He had met Davidson before, and that had been an unhappy occasion, one in which he had found the prize agent representing his one-time commanding officer to be a fount of unwelcome news. But his exploits in the Mediterranean had brought him a prize ship, a French sloop by the name of Mariette, subsequently bought into the service by Lord Hood and renamed. In need of someone to contract his business, he had sent written instructions to the only man whose name he knew to see to the distribution for both himself and the crew he had led.
"Mr. Pearce, it is a pleasure to finally meet you," said Davidson, as Pearce entered his office, the greeting followed by a quizzical look. "But I have the feeling, a strong one, we have met before, sir."
There was silence then, as Davidson tried to place him. Pearce had come here just after his elevation to get his share of the capture of the French 74, the story of which he had just been relating to Winston. He had departed with a lot less than he hoped.
"We have, Mr. Davidson. I came to see you about moneys from the Valmy."
"Sir, I place you now," the man responded, clearly surprised. "I cannot feel that our previous encounter endeared me to you."
"You act as a prize agent, do you not?"
"For several naval officers, yes."
"And I take it your actions were not motivated by personal animus in denying me my rightful share of the capture?"
"No."
"Then might I ask how matters proceed in that case, since my entire claim is not settled?"
Davidson sighed. "The Valmy is locked in the courts, sir, with the legal wolves of Gray's Inn, not more than a stone's throw from where we sit, feeding heartily at the trough of both parties. For, bought into the service at £12 a ton, with both gun and head money, she was a valuable prize. Neither of the litigants will give way and reconcile, and I fear, if they do not have a care, there will be little of value left to settle on."
"Then I can only wish them both damnation, sir. But today I have come to see how I stand regarding the vessel I took in Corsica."
"You did not receive my letter regarding that?" Davidson was a good-looking man, in his early 30s, sandy-haired and with lively, open features. Now the countenance had about it an air of foreboding, and since Pearce did not respond, his face merely closing up, he was forced to continue. "I fear you will find yourself in the same boat with the widow of Captain Benton."
"Go on,"
Pearce responded, his heart sinking. "She has laid a claim to the captain's share, given her husband was in command when the action commenced. Let me say, Mr. Pearce, that she has no choice but to proceed, being in straitened circumstances." Pearce was about to allude to the year's pay which would come her way by right as a serving officer's widow, added to what had been realised by the sale of Benton's possessions, admittedly not much after the purser's 20% emolument. But he checked himself. Benton might have been master and commander, but his pay was that of a lieutenant, £91 in a calendar year, and that was not great, added to which he had no idea of dependence.
"Which means?"
he asked. "That she will pursue the case to the bitter end, sir, for she has nothing to lose."
"So what would you suggest I do?"
"A settlement, which is what I proposed in my letter to you. Share the windfall with the lady on an equal basis, and I think she will be content." Davidson paused then, slightly embarrassed. "You do, of course, have the right to seek advice elsewhere. I am aware that I seem to be disappointing you for a second time." Pearce looked away from Davidson then, his eyes scanning the portrait-covered walls and his mind ranging over the matter. Others were involved, the crew of HMS Weasel who took part in the action, but they would not be affected by any decision he made. And while he was thinking on that, Davidson was still talking. "Naturally, we are talking only of the captain's 2/8, which would not affect your 1/8 as the sole lieutenant on the vessel. So you would emerge as the superior beneficiary, giving you, if my memory is correct, some £581 less my fees of 12% and a modicum of expenses. Then, of course, there are the prize court costs."
"You can quote such figures from memory?"
asked Pearce, far from amused. "God has granted me a head for figures," Davidson replied. Pearce looked over his head to where a charcoal sketch sat on the wall, a full-length study of a young officer in a lieutenant's uniform, and the face was familiar.
"Is that Captain Nelson?"
Davidson brightened, as if relieved at the subject moving to one less contentious, and turned to look at the same sketch. "Being some 17 years old at the time, he was no captain, Mr. Pearce, as his garb will tell you. It was a preliminary drawing made prior to a portrait executed by the artist Rigaud, who was good enough to sell it to me. The actual painting went to his old mentor, Captain William Locker, at present the governor of Greenwich Hospital."
"And you have it on your wall?"
"I am happy to say that Horatio is not only a client, but also a close friend of long standing, one I have represented for many a year. If anything, I pursue the profession of prize agent due to him, given I was in the general Canada trade prior to this." Davidson gave a look of realization before adding, "But of course, you would have encountered Captain Nelson in your recent service."
"On more than one occasion."
"He is an honest fellow, Horatio, and a damn fine sailor." Pearce had to stop himself from saying that his acquaintance was slight, and also that Horatio Nelson was an absolute booby at times, excessively light-headed in the article of drink, and damn silly when it came to the opposite sex, a fellow who caused much anxiety in the breasts of his junior officers, which Pearce had witnessed at a ball in Leghorn. It said much for the man that those same junior officers cared enough to shield him from his own folly, whatever his qualities of command and seamanship.
"I found him so,"
was what Pearce actually replied, which was nothing but the truth, for there was an endearing openness about the man to modify his faults. He was thinking that, If this Davidson was trusted by the likes of Nelson, he too was probably honest, if anyone could be said to be that in the modern world, which was important, given he was about to mention another commission.
What would another prize agent tell me, Mr. Davidson, in such circumstances that you would not?
Lieutenant Pearce, there are upright fellows in this game, but there are as many rogues in the profession as there are in others. It is not unknown for one of my stripe to make more in douceurs from interested lawyers than they would ever make from a client.
Meaning?
They would advise you to fight a case you may well not win, from what they would gain by the back door, an agreed percentage of the lawyer's fees. I am happy to recommend another prize agent, but if he is honest, he will give you the same advice as I have proffered. I might also add Mrs. Benton has a particularly avaricious counsel, and even what I have proposed may not go smoothly.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
That was telling. You did not have to serve in the Navy very long to hear the stories of prize case disputes dragging on for a decade and more. Pride as often the driving force of the argument as mere coin. He needed money, and he needed it soon to pursue Ralph Barkley. It would appear best to settle.
Mr. Davidson, I will take your advice on the Mariette, and also advise you that on my return to Portsmouth, I brought in another prize, a merchant vessel, the Guiscard.
Pearce reached into a pocket and pulled out a paper showing the details of the tonnage, as well as the names of the men he had had with him when he came across her, who would be entitled to a share.
The details are listed on this. She is at present in Portsmouth being valued, but it is only the hull. There was no cargo, no crew for head money, and not even a signal cannon.
An unusual capture, sir, I must say. Legitimate prize?
Undoubtedly so.
Any other king's ship in sight? Pearce shook his head, acknowledging there could be no other claimants. You seem to be a lucky officer, sir.
If you knew the means by which we came upon her, and what we found aboard, you would not say so.
Would an inquiry be unwelcome? Having spent too much time talking to Winston and relating his adventures, Pearce had no desire to recommence now.
Another time, Mr. Davidson, perhaps, given I have another call to make. I take it all is in order for you to proceed?
Looking at the paper before him, Davidson nodded. I will send to Portsmouth immediately, advising them of my interest.
Can I ask if you satisfied matters at Nerot's Hotel?
Pearce, on his last sojourn in London, had been obliged to depart that particular establishment in some haste, being bereft of the funds needed to satisfy a bill that included not only his room and food, but the uniforms he had ordered made as well. Part of his instructions on appointing the man before him had been to deal with the outstanding bill. I did.
Good. Could I ask you to send a message to them to say I wish to occupy a room tonight?
Of course, sir. And will you require an advance on your funds?
50 guineas?
Pearce inquired tentatively, knowing the protections would eat off a slice of that, adding,
I anticipate some immediate expenses.
Most certainly, Lieutenant Pearce, Davidson replied with a confident air, standing and producing from his waistcoat a chain, on which was a hefty key. Once the matter is settled, I will remit the balance to your bank.
Mr. Davidson, I do not have a bank.
Never mind, the man replied gaily. I am happy to recommend Baring Brothers as a sound repository of your moneys. Pearce and Ralph Barkley were not shadowing each other, but the post-captain was likewise with his prize agents, sitting in the opulent offices of Omani and Druce, overlooking the Strand, nursing a fine crystal glass which contained within it a very superior Burgundy wine. This, while the two partners of the well-established practice quite openly flattered him. Barkley could not but contrast their behaviour with his last call at these premises, when, at the outbreak of the present war, he had been newly appointed to his frigate after 5 years on the beach. Half pay and the mere expenses of living, not least in the caring for his clutch of sisters and the acquisition of a new bride, had left him seriously short of the moneys he needed to fulfil his duties. The reluctance of this pair to advance him any on his prospects had forced him to pay the high rates of a city moneylender. But what had hurt more than their parsimony had been their disdain. They had treated him like a beggar, which was the precise opposite of their present behaviour, for Ralph Barclay was now a man of substantial means, having taken a fully laden merchant vessel in the Levant trade from under the nose of a Barbary pirate, his 2/8 of that capture alone exceeding £10,000. There was another, even more valuable Indiaman, locked in a dispute between whether it was a prize or salvage, which, if it came in as the former, would more than double his gains. He had been sailing under Admiralty orders and was thus entitled to 3/8. Added to that, his interview with Gardner had gone well. The Admiral was well disposed in any case. The name of the Duke of Portland was of inestimable value, too. An ounce of interest, as the old saying went, being worth a ton of ability, and this pair had heard that his prospects were excellent. If there was a fly in the ointment of his pleasure, it was that Samuel Hood, as his commanding admiral for the Levant vessel, would get 1/8 of the value of that. Also that the Gibraltar prize court, into which his claim had been submitted, was home to the most rapacious adjudicator on the planet.
"Admiral Gardner did not name a vessel, Captain Barclay?" asked Omany, looking as prosperous and self-satisfied as Barclay remembered him. He was a man with a belly and rubicund face that spoke of long indulgence in the good things of life. The reply followed a draining of his wine.
"No, but he assured me that my claim for a command was high on his list, and would be met as soon as I was fit enough to go back to sea. I have high hopes of a 74, HMS Simile, at present refitting at Chatham."
That was followed by a keen look to observe what these men knew, and the nods told Ralph Barclay that his connection to the Duke of Portland, if it could be called that, to one of the most supercilious, condescending bastards he had ever met in his life, was well known within these walls. They would also know that HMS Simile was near ready for sea. Before him was a pair who sniffed gossip as a hunting hound sniffs spore, picking up rumours as much as hard fact as an aid to their business activities, which went well beyond merely acting as prize agents to some of the most successful sailors in the fleet. Several admirals, always the men to profit most by the exploits of their captains, taking a full 1/8 of any prizes brought in, were their clients. Indeed, Ralph Barclay had been introduced to them by none other than the late Lord Rodney, his one-time patron, and on their walls sat an imposing painting of that sailor's most famous Caribbean victory, the Battle of the Saints, in which he had bested the fleet of the Comte de Grasse. He and Alan Gardner had already shared claret and memories of the Admiral's part in the action.
"Then we wish you joy of your prospects, sir,"
added Druce, the smaller of the pair, raising his glass only to realise a toast was impossible.
"But, sir, your glass is empty."
A flick of a finger brought forward the liveried servant, the crystal decanter and a silver tray to top Barclay up, as Druce moved on to business.
"I think, Captain Barclay, we must look at some investments for your profits."
"Which, of course, we would be happy to advise you on," Omany added. "The major portion should be placed in the Consolidated Fund, naturally, but there are certain speculative ventures from which you might benefit handsomely. We act as agents for several canal and turnpike trusts, which promise good returns, some as much as 10% per annum.
There is something of a building boom in progress in my native Frome."
There was mischief in the statement, his way of guying this pair, a touch of revenge for their previous attitude. What he was saying clearly did not please them, much as they feigned interest. They wanted his money to play with and profit by, which would not be the case if he favoured his own notions.
"Added to that, I have always thought land around my birthplace a good area to invest."
"Fluctuation, sir," sighed Omany in a theatrical manner, "has too often been the death of wise placement. Land rises and falls in value, especially if we have peace. Buildings, and I take it you mean domestic dwellings, require close supervision, or those carrying out the construction will find a home for your materials that is to their profit, not yours."
"If you are at sea, Captain Barclay,"
Druce added, merely opening his hands, not seeing the need to add any more. In truth, the man drinking their wine wanted nothing more than to see income without effort on his part, a dream he had carried since first he went as a lad to sea, the hope of every naval officer, the capital of prize money earning by its mere existence. But trust was not a virtue to which Ralph Barclay was given, and he certainly did not repose it in this pair, who, if he lost on their proposed investments, would ensure that they did not suffer likewise. It was the way of all projectors, men who never took a risk with their own funds unless they could make a killing by some chicanery, like inside knowledge of guaranteed outcomes. These were investments into which their clients were never allowed.
"I employ a man who deals with my affairs," he said,
his eye acute enough to see the slight change in their expressions.
"Not that he will be ashore when I have a ship. He is, after all, my clerk. But I will task him to work with you, to look over what you propose, for he has a sharp mind, unlike me. I am, after all, more of a sailor than a man of business."
"As you wish," Omni replied.
Both partners were well aware of what Barclay was saying. Your investments will be studied and your fees scrutinized for any signs of excess payments by someone who knows the byways of financial transactions. You will not treat me as you normally treat naval officers, safe off at sea and usually too unquestioning for their own welfare.
"I shall send him to you, and you may show him a list of your speculative proposals. His name is Cornelius Gearson."
Had Ralph Barclay not drunk deep then, and had he not been quite so self-satisfied, he might have noticed that the name registered with Mr. Druce, and whatever connection he made was not a happy one. Chapter 5. The grinding of the jolly boat on the soft sandy beach on a cold grey and misty dawn still left several feet of shallow water to be crossed, so the trio of pelicans, having thrown ahead of them their sack of provisions, came ashore with wet feet, albeit their newly sewn trews were rolled up and their shore-going footwear, stockings as well, were safe in their ditty-bags. Michael O'Hagan crossed himself as the boat, relieved of their weight, floated off immediately, with the carpenter, who now had the oars they had used to get to this point, quick to drop them into the water and spin round to haul off. There was no farewell, no cheering cry of good fortune to set them on their way, which reflected the silence with which he had accompanied them on the journey. It had not been a trip laced with anything in the way of conversation or advice. The sight that greeted them, a huge area of flat, damp sand, turning to a bank of that mixed with shingle, quite some way off, in a featureless landscape, did not cheer either, while one isolated lean-to hut far away along the highest point of the scrub-covered dune, in truth not much in height, showed no sign of occupancy. Along the seemingly endless shoreline, in the distance, a few forlorn-looking boats were up out of the water, sitting on the bulks of round, tar-soaked timber used to protect the hull from damage as it was hauled above the high water mark. That a wavy line of seaweed stretching away on either side, while in the direction from which they had come, a faint outline of what they had been told was Hayling Island. A thick line of trees was just visible through the mist. The sounds were few, the hiss of the waves running up the sand behind them, the odd cry of a gull, always sounding dejected, all under a lowering grey sky that merged with both land and sea. Rufus rolled down his trews and looked set to put on his stockings and the new shoes provided by the purser.
"Belay that," Michael barked. "Wait till your feet are dry and free of sand, boy, or they'll be bleeding before you've gone a mile."
"A mile to where?"
Rufus responded, with a bit of a pout at being admonished.
"First, we must get off the beach and see if we can find something to get our bearings."
"We should eat,"
Charlie Taverner added, as they made to a dune, partially covered in a line of dark green scrub and high tufts of marsh grass.
"Shortly,"
Michael said. Topping the dune, through a tiny gap, no doubt made by locals, looking into the land behind, flat fields of grazing sheep, dotted with stunted trees too sparsely gathered close to the shore to provide any shelter, Michael scanned the landscape, grey where sky and mist combined. He pulled from his pocket the drawing the master had made for them, showing roughly a route they should follow, which would take them away from the many inlets that dotted the shore, with crosses to denote towns, places to be avoided. He had also written the names, but Michael only knew them from the memory of them having been spoken, for he could not read more than a few words. All he knew for certain was that they were to make sure to avoid the Portsmouth to London road, bound to be crawling with crimps.
"We has to get to the east of a place called Chichester, and aim for a town further on called Midhurst."
"What bearings might we be looking for?"
"Church spires, Rufus," Michael said. "Though sure enough, they will be hard to spot in this mess. You makes your way in England from parish to parish. For sure, there is always a path from one to t'other. I swear on the blood of Holy Mary, you won't go far in this land before you spot a house of worship, never mind it being one tied to a heathen faith."
"The Irish are the godless ones,"
said Charlie, without rancour. He spat after he said that. Michael, being a papist, was not commonly a bone of contention, but Charlie, who would likely never have entered the portal of a church except to steal its plate or raid the candlebox, was not about to have his nation's Anglican religion insulted by a Catholic Irishman. Rufus looked at the grey sky, then at the paper in Michael's hand.
"How will we know he's going in the right direction?"
"Sure, there are ways, and many of those same churches have a pointer to the north of the spire. If in real doubt, we'll have to ask, will we not?"
"A risk, Michael?"
"One we might have to hazard if the sun don't show. According to the ship's master, London is to the north and east of where we are."
"To the north and east of where we think we are,"
Charlie objected, talking to a man who had turned round to look back out to sea.
"Get down!"
Michael cried, immediately dropping behind the deep scrub and scrabbling for better cover.
"A guard boat!"
"Where away?"
demanded Charlie, who had followed him down automatically, with only Rufus still visible. That was until Michael took his legs from under him. The youngster collapsed in a heap of arms, legs, and swearing that ceased as his landing winded him.
"In the distance to the east, following the shoreline, a cutter by the shape and size, and low in the water from the number of men it's carrying. It's no fisherman."
A short crawl still gave him cover, but also a view over the sea, and that showed no sign of their carpenter. He had rowed out of sight in haste, and the thought could not be avoided that the men who had suggested this route of escape must have known it would be patrolled for deserters, a notion he shared with his companions, and one that brought forth from Charlie a long list of expletives for not being given any warning. Ignoring him, Michael edged his head out enough to look along the beach. The guard boat, which he had first seen as an indistinct shape in the mist, was now in plain sight, and it had not altered course, still hugging the shoreline at a steady pace, but it took no great genius to work out that someone aboard would be looking into the soft sand below the high water line for footprints.
"We must get away from this shore and quickly."
Michael was moving as he was explaining. The marks of their landing would stick out like a pus-filled boil, and as soon as they were spotted, the boat would beach, and those aboard would come inland to hunt for them. The only hope he could think of was to outrun them first and find somewhere to hide up next.
"Stop!"
Charlie Taverner's voice was so commanding that the Irishman obeyed.
"Now get shod and do as I say."
Still sat down, Charlie was already scrabbling in his ditty bag to get out and slip on his shoes, talking as he did so.
"We'll not lose the men in that boat, and for all we know they're armed with muskets. So all they need is a sight of our backs to bring us to."
"So?"
"Look at the sand we have to walk through to get into grassland," Charlie insisted. "It's damp from the morning dew, so we cannot avoid leaving a trail."
"Shoes won't help," Michael insisted.
"Then watch what I do,"
Charlie commanded. Standing, he made heavy steps through the sand, sure enough leaving obvious footprints, and, as soon as he reached the point where the ground underfoot turned from mixed to pure grass, he stopped, then very carefully walked back into his own footmarks. He'd just got back to the point where he started when a cry floated through the morning air. The men in the boat had spotted what they were set to look for, a line of prints pointing to where the Pelicans had stopped to get their bearings.
"Do the same, Michael. You too, Rufus. Then we must look for cover in this scrub, just enough to keep us hidden."
Charlie, frustrated at their lack of speed, positively hissed,
"Will you move your arses, or we'll be had up, and don't you go making it all too neat. Try to make it look as if it was in file."
As his companions complied, with an air of doubt as to whether what they were about was wise, very obvious in their attitude, Charlie had his clasp knife out and was sawing at the branch of a bush, talking all the while. As soon as it was separated, he spat on his finger, picked up some sand, rubbed that and his spittle together, and used it to cover the fresh-cut wood, making dark what had been a clear white cut.
The tide was making when we landed, so them coves will not know how long we's been ashore. Could be minutes, could be near to a glass of sand. When you's done, get your shoes off again and back in your ditty bags.
The air was now full of faint voices, some just shouts, spliced with the odd clear command, and each of the trio of pelicans had in their mind a vision of what would be happening shoreside of the dune. The cutter being beached, men leaping out with cutlasses certainly, and maybe a musket or two, hard-eyed bastards, maybe marines, more likely press-gang tars, who would be keen to take them up for the bounty, or maybe just for the sheer joy of capture.
They must have known them sods,
wailed Rufus, sat again and removing his shoes.
And they said not a word. Course they knew, Charlie hissed. They just wanted rid of us. But no more talking. Get in among them bushes. You too, Michael, while I spoil our trail. We don't need to go far to lie down and be hidden, and for the sake of the Lord, breathe easy when you've settled.
Crawling through the bushes to the sound of hearty shouting from the beach, ditty bags and the sack of provisions before them, they did not see Charlie back into the greenery, brushing the sand behind them to remove any trace of their passage. He had not gone far when he heard the first sound of shod feet on the seaside of the dune, scrabbling on the shingle, which had him pushing himself down so hard it was as if he wished the earth to swallow him up. Godless he might be, but the prayers he was mouthing now were as fervent as those of Michael O'Hagan had ever been.
"Here, Lieutenant," called a voice. "They sat here a while by the state of the sand?"
"How long, man?"
came the gruff cry, obviously the voice of an officer by his impatience.
"Hard to say precise, Your Honour, but not too much time's passed. They shooed up here, and I can see their marks as they made their way inland."
"Right. Set off a musket. Let the inshore picket know we're on the hunt."
The crack of the fired weapon rent the air, which had all three hidden pelicans digging their fingers into the sand, as though the weapon had been aimed at them. Noisy bird calls were aired too, and for the same reason. For Charlie it was worst of all. Closer than the others to the gap, he could see the striped woolen stockings and boots of the man leading the hunt. They soon disappeared, and another dozen legs went by, one with white stockings, which had to be the officer. The whole party a mass of eager, mumbled voices. The one of the man in charge the only clear sound, his voice gruff.
"We must hurry, lads, and keep a sharp eye out. We don't want those scallies at Bracklesham Church to get the bounty for 3 men run, do we now? They're an extra pot of ale for the one to spy them first."
The sound of movement and voices died away, the last discernible order from the officer for his men to spread out a bit and cover more ground, with Rufus whispering,
"Christ, that were close." "Be quiet," Charlie hissed. "There will be fellows still with that boat."
Michael crawled close to Charlie's ear.
"Sure, you were sharp there, Charlie boy. But what do we do now?" "We must get along the shoreline, away from whence they came, and lay low until dark." "And then what?" "Pray to your papist God for a moon, Michael, for without one we'll be stuck."
The progress was slow, great care taken to ensure that no one could see them, with Charlie's cut branch employed continually to hide their trail. This, as the cloud cover began to lift and the first signs came of a watery sun. Hundreds of yards away from the point at which they had come ashore, they found a clump of low trees and bushes, in which they could at least sit up and occasionally stand to study the land around.
"Best rest up here," Michael said. "The more we move, the more we rest till the hunt is called off." "Oh, sods, curse them,"
Charlie moaned, with neither of his companions needing to inquire of whom he was speaking.
"And what makes you think those after us will give up?" "It's a hope, brother." "We ain't got a prayer," groaned Rufus. "We always has a prayer," Michael replied. "And sure, if you say enough of them and mean it, the good Lord above will hear them."
Those words and the way they were delivered got the Irishman a look from Charlie that would not have shamed old Nick himself, so full was it of doubt.
"The question is, how far will they go afore they see they's missed us and give up? They might set pickets out overnight." "If there's a bounty, Michael," Charlie snorted,
And there surely will be. Then it's not just their pickets we need to worry on. Every bumpkin in creation will be on the watch for miles inland. For 3 tars, Charlie. Remember our gaze of weather tarpaulin? Well, that won't suffice if we add up close to shore. No, but it is a start, Charlie. And we must find a barn or outhouse and look to steal some tools. What kind of tools? Asked Rufus. Farm stuff. Or maybe the kind of shovels that will let us pass for men working to repair the roads.
Seeing the doubt in their faces, Michael had to tell them that in his travels along the byways of the land, he had seen many a time small parties of men paid by the parish to keep the roads in decent repair.
Not that they stay free of holes, so it's permanent work that folk are obliged to do.
Poor souls' labour, opined Rufus.
Our ditty bags we must keep hidden, Michael added. We must not be seen as travelling men.
They sat there until the light began to fade, the inside of the hiding place made darker by the overhead cover, eating the biscuit they had been given, grateful it was shore-made and no more than a few days old, for lacking water or any other liquid, real hardtack would have been inedible, though it was hard to swallow even with cheese.
That was a clever ruse, Charlie, said Michael. Where did that notion of the bush come from?
A bit of praise lifted Charlie's spirits.
I got it from an ancient fellow who was done for thieving when a nipper and transported to the Virginia colony. That was until the Jonathans decided they did not like King George any more than we did in London town.
Sure, he's not much loved in Ireland, brother.
Well, this old cove worked his time and took to farming, then fought the Redskins when they were siding with the French, and he told us some of their wiles, for as he said, you could never see the buggers in the forests. But there were locals who knew what to look for, and brushing away their trail was one of the signs, as were fresh broken twigs.
Charlie suddenly waxed lyrical.
Often thought when things weren't too good that I'd have liked to go to the Americas.
Too late now, Michael said.
What about walking backwards? Rufus asked. Oh, that was my own notion, Charlie replied, which is a handy one to use when you're seeking to break and enter over soft ground, like a vicar's flower bed.
Sharp, Charlie.
Were it, Rufus? I don't think it was that sharp. If I'd not had me wits about me, I would have had us walking backwards as soon as we landed. Then those bastards in the guard boat would have rowed right on, instead of stopping thinking we was just fisher folk going out on our common business.
Now that, Charlie, is a sound notion. Charlie had to peer at Michael in the gloom to make out his smile.
Holy Mary, I've walked too many miles in my days to take pleasure in it, and being a tar for all this time has not endeared me. What better way to get to where we need to go than by boat? You have noticed, Michael, that we ain't got one.
There was boats along the shore. We saw them, and the master, who did that drawing, penned the shoreline as well, all the way to the waters that lead up to London.
We've neither oars or the means to raise a sail in the buggers, if the folk that own them have a brain.
Can we not steal those? Asked Rufus. Instead of shovels? Charlie laughed, the first sign of real humour the whole day.
You spend too much time in my company, Rufus. You've come to think like a felon. If we get back to the Liberties, I'll send you out a-dipping along the Strand.
There'll be no fear, Rufus replied, with more force than he usually employed. Was a time I would have worried, but not no more, mate. Michael was not finished.
The only thing we must have is some water. Sure, with that we could sit here till things die down. I don't know much about that drawing you're on about, Michael, but I do know it has to be a hell of a row all the way to the Thames, and that takes no account of weather.
If we have to land, Charlie, and walk after all, at least it will be well away from these men, now hunting our hides, and the hue and the cry they'll set up.
What about staying hidden? Rufus suggested. And what if they sense we ain't left the area and start a search of every hiding place, which I humbly put forward they will know like the back of their hands?
You can be a miserable soul, Charlie Tevner.
No, Rufus, I am a man who was raised to think how to avoid either the rope or the transport ship, which is 2 risks I have faced all my life. And if I was that officer, I would have men out hunting first light. We ain't safe here, and even if it is pitch dark, we has to move. We'll try for your boat first, Michael, that being a good notion. But as sure as God made little apples, we must be away from this place whatever way we can. And I'm going to suggest that the best time to move is afore the light is gone complete, so that we can at least work out that we's going in the right direction."
"Could we find some water to drink?" asked Rufus.
"First thing," Charlie replied, beginning to gather up his possessions. "Christ, I'm as dry as a witch's tit."
Chapter 6. The last call John Pearce had made the previous evening had been to the home of Heinrich Lutjens, near St. Bartholomew's Hospital, to reacquaint himself with the one-time surgeon of HMS Brilliant, and see if any word had come from Downing Street, this being the address he had given. Faced with a negative response, he could at least openly fulminate about the duplicity of politicians. An offer of accommodation he declined, but the invitation to stay to supper and share a beefsteak from nearby Smithfield Market was welcome. He was now nursing an after-dinner brandy, and the subject had moved on, very naturally, to the potential to indict Ralph Barclay.
"I think I might be damned by the loss of those papers, Heinrich."
The look that engendered, a pursing of the lips and a peaked expression of the surgeon's fish-like face, as well as a dilation of his pointed nose, had Pearce apologising immediately.
"I bear you no ill will for that. You only managed to rescue your sea chest, and it was my idea to leave them in your care."
"And mine to hide them in my instrument chest."
There was a moment, then, when Pearce considered adding that it had been a wise precaution. On the night he and his fellow pelicans went ashore in Gibraltar, someone, he was sure, had rifled the chest in his wardroom cabin, and he doubted it could have been one-armed Ralph Barclay, more likely Gearson. It was that which had decided Pearce to leave the copy of the transcript of Ralph Barclay's court-martial with Lutjens, when he had only intended to have the surgeon care for them when he was off the ship for one night. But that was none of the host's concern, and something best kept to himself.
"Did you ever find out how the fire started? It had to be carelessness on someone's part."
There was no denying that as a fact. If there was one overriding fear sailors had, it was of a fire at sea. Something that could rapidly destroy a wooden ship, leaving those aboard no time to get off. Great care was taken with lanterns and stoves to ensure nothing could set the timbers alight, and buckets of sand were liberally distributed around the vessel to douse anything accidental. The crew of HMS Grampus had been as assiduous in that as every other vessel, yet catch fire it did, and quickly, spreading until it consumed the whole vessel and forced the captain, in a very short time, to order it abandoned.
"The culprit is still breathing," Lutjens added, "for every man aboard was brought safe back to England."
Seeing speculation on that as a dead end, no one would admit to the guilt, and if it had not been discovered by now, it never would be. Pearce went back to his primary concern.
"My first task is to find an attorney to handle my case."
"Does not this Davidson fellow have someone?"
"Well, that places too many eggs in one basket, friend, and the only people I know personally are my father's old acquaintances in the London Corresponding Society."
The reply was sharp.
"They, I must tell you, are best avoided."
"That is unlike you, Heinrich."
"There are moves afoot to curb their activities, John."
Lutjens made a great play of rising then to poke the fire, which allowed him to avoid the keen look he was getting from his guest. As the son of the pastor of the Lutheran Church in London, he was connected to the court, Queen Charlotte being a regular visitor at that establishment, sometimes accompanied by the king, and, if they could be dragooned into worship, the royal children as well. It was no secret that Farmer George hated the radicals who made up the various corresponding societies that had sprung up after the overthrow of King Louis, the London branch being the most numerous and vociferous, and, in his antipathy, he was fully supported by William Pitt. To John Pearce it was typical of monarchy and those who served them. They saw every gathering of citizens at which free discussion was the aim as inimical to their security. His own father, Adam, had been more outre than most society participants, more outspoken in his calls for universal suffrage and an end to the system of rotten boroughs, demanding votes for both sexes and all citizens in equal measures, as well as a curb on the constitutional power of the monarchy, if not its actual abolition, all underpinned by a more equable distribution of the nation's wealth. These ideas, penned in pamphlets, spoken of on innumerable platforms, were notions Adam Pearce, known as the Edinburgh Ranter, had actually been propounding for his whole life. But the revolution in France had changed everything, including his father's stature, first being welcomed by a nation that saw itself better governed than its continental neighbour, then causing fear as the excesses of the Parisian mob, egged on by fiery orators, had turned the bright new dawn into blood-soaked mayhem. That change in attitude had resulted in a short stay in prison for both son John and old Adam. They had been locked up and, after their release, given Adam had gone straight back to further writings and speech-making, had been forced to flee to Paris to avoid that writ for sedition. Lutyens took a particularly hearty poke at a log, sending up a shower of bright sparks.
"The king is sure there are mobs who would wish to see the guillotine set up in the Horse Guards parade grounds, with him as the primary victim. Then he has no understanding of revolution and what causes it."
Lutyens looked at Pearce then and smiled.
"And naturally you do."
Not sure if it was a question, Pearce declined to reply, but had he done so, he would have pointed out that, at its very simplest, it was not mobs of the poor that made revolt a success, but the break between those who sought to wield untrammelled power and the desire for a say in matters of those with the means to finance their dreams of glory. King Charles had faced the axe over money, or a lack of it. So, in truth, had King Louis. Both had lost their heads for hanging on to an outmoded concept of kingship, in which they expected their every desire to be treated and provided for as if handed down from the gospel. Underlying those thoughts was the very potent truth that, in growing to manhood in Paris, John Pearce had begun to see that his father's propositions, hitherto holy writ to a young lad, had within them serious flaws. They took no account of the base nature of the people Adam wished to enfranchise. This despite the observations both had made while incarcerated in the common cells of the Fleet. It was all very well for Adam Pearce to say that better education would produce a better polity. Given the venal nature of those with education, like those firebrands in France, there was no evidence to suppose such an assertion to be true.
If Farmer George was one to ask my advice, I would tell him to surrender with grace that which he cannot keep. For not to do so risks having it taken away by forces, which once unleashed, as events in France have shown, become uncontrollable.
Not words he would receive kindly, John.
Axe and guillotine blades are more cruel by far than a few home truths.
Pearce was unsure where Lutyens stood on such matters. His own ultimate view had been formed in Paris when the bright promise of the overthrow of the monarchy had turned to bloody and uncontainable violence, a bloodbath that had, in the end, consumed his own father. Adam Pearce had discovered very quickly, having fled from the risk of arrest at home, that revolutionaries were no more inclined to tolerate dissent than monarchs or their minions, and had ended up in the prison of the conciergerie because of it.
We must change a subject which is of necessity an unpleasant one for you.
His friend had misunderstood Pearce's allusion to instruments of beheading, but he was right. He had been a witness to his father's death, having had to move heaven and earth to recover and properly bury his body, only succeeding with the aid of a sympathetic revolutionary politician, Régis de Cambaceres. It was a very painful subject, and one which had him fingering the tin of Parisian earth he carried with him, taken from the churchyard of Saint-Sulpice, where old Adam was interred. How his father would have hated that as a resting place. He hated all churches, and that one was Catholic. One day, Pearce had vowed, he would be rescued from that cold grave and have his bones taken back to his native Edinburgh and more suitable ground.
"A lawyer?"
Pearce asked. Unbeknown to his guest, that put Lutyens on the horns of a dilemma. The only man he could truly recommend, he had also recommended to Emily Barclay. Would their paths cross?
"Come along, Heinrich, you must know someone."
Caught on the hop, Lutyens was forced to reply, "There is a fellow called Studdert."
"I'll take his address, then," Pearce said with soft interruption. "And then, for I'm beat, I must be off to my hotel."
Which is?
Nerot's in King Street.
That, John Pearce, Lutyens joked, his face lighting up at his coming sally, is the last address at which you should reside.
It was not just a want of oars that made the finding of a suitable boat difficult on a strand of beach that stretched for miles. No owner was content to leave their possession beached without chaining it to a dog, so every approach over the noisy shingle, the craft were pulled up and away from the sand and the high tide line, was met by first a growl, that followed by barking, and, if further approach was attempted, by gnashing canine teeth, the din alone being enough to make the pelicans sheer off and seek shelter back in the trees, eyes peeled to observe if anyone had reacted, not least if those out hunting them were within earshot. The morning, since grey dawn, had been spent creeping along the shore with great care, scurrying from hideout to hideout, trying never to expose themselves to sight, unless it was unavoidable and of necessity. They were making slow progress. They had at least found a dribble of a watercourse which had allowed them to drink, thus relieving a raging thirst, but bringing on its own annoyance in the very obvious fact that they had no means of taking any water with them, lacking as they did the means to carry it, which had them eyeing the grey skies, wondering if it might rain.
"It's not just oars, Michael," Charlie said. "We must find a flagon or such like. There's no joy in being on salt water without we have something fresh to drink.
Maybe we'll find some beer.
Only if there's a God that loves us."
He loves the likes of me, Charlie.
"Then only he knows why, Michael,"
Charlie sallied, only partly in jest, given they had a history of dispute.
"For you are a cussed sod."
The boat owners, those who had possession of both oars and water containers, lived inland in the cottages sparsely dotted about the coastal marshes, far enough away to justify the dogs and to give them some protection from the winds, which on this coast were ferocious, as well as an occasional heavy tide surge that must overwhelm the shingle barrier. They must make their main living from the fish in the sea, and on a day like this, most would be out with their nets and lines. It took no great thought to work out the reasons why those who were not had such craft. There were pots by the boats, and there would be more off the shore, buoyed on the surface, sitting on the seabed to catch crabs and lobsters, traps not worth visiting on a daily basis. It was neglect that provided what they were seeking, a boat owner so uncaring of his guard animal that what greeted them when they crept towards it was not the usual sounds but a faint whimpering. The beast, lying within the thwarts, a collar and chained round its neck, turned out to be a sad-looking creature, and not just in the weak brown eyes. His coat was unkempt and showing sores, while the very visible ribs underneath spoke of a severe lack of nourishment, so much so that when Rufus proffered a bit of cheese, it produced the first response that could be described as animated. The dog grabbed it and consumed it greedily.
"Poor bugger is starving,"
Rufus said.
"So will we be, if you go and give it our grub,"
Charlie complained. Michael was less troubled.
"Sure, give the poor mate another bit. But I go look to see who might be the possessor of this creel. Whoever he is has little fear of Davy Jones," Charlie said, rubbing the strakes of peeling timber. "I reckon the only thing holding this in one piece is the varnish."
"She's a sorry-looking bugger, sure enough, but it will hold 3 and float."
"Which we are preparing to row out on if we can find the sticks, Michael."
"I thought we agreed," the Irishman replied. "Water is safer than land." Charlie kicked the boat, but not too hard.
"Well, I'm not sure with this under my arse."
"Has to be in use, Charlie. There's not a drop of water in the thing." Rufus, who had been patting the acquiescent dog, reached a bit further to touch the bottom board. "She's damp, but that could be rain. And if she weren't used, she'd be turned turtle."
"Well, unchain the dog. See where he leads."
"What if he barks?" Rufus asked. Charlie pulled a face.
"He ain't got the puff."
There was truth in that. The animal had to be lifted out of the boat, and even then there was no scamper in his gait, more the stiff-legged walk of a beast on its last legs. Once over the dunes and in a clump of trees, they could see a tumbled-down hovel, too broken to be called a cottage, which, even at a distance, seemed to be held together by tarred canvas, not nails,
with Michael of the opinion that a creature who let an abode fall into such disrepair was promising.
"Best you two wait here," he said. "No sense in we three exposing ourselves. Anyone out hunting us and spotting one person, even with such a mangy dog, will reckon he belongs."
If the Irishman had expected dispute, he was not granted any. Charlie and Rufus were only too willing to stay as safe as they could, and it did make sense. If there was a human in that hovel, then a bit of intimidation might be in order, and when it came to that, O'Hagan, with his height and build, plus a face which, for all he was a smiling fellow normally, could look very ferocious, was just the man. As he followed the dog across the ground, soft underfoot, for it was marsh, Michael could see, now that the air was a bit more clear, that this flat landscape extended well inland to a very obvious line of dark green, forested hills, and that reinforced his thought that a boat would be safest. There was a serious lack of cover on such a windswept shore. It was the kind of place where anyone on a high spot, even a man-made structure like a church tower, could see for miles around. The door, when he approached it, seemed to be hanging off what passed for its hinges, rotten wooden dowels poorly fixed on the main frame, with rusted iron hoops sat over them, just adding to the run-down nature of the whole. The dog had disappeared inside, through a gap in the board wall, moving faster than it had previously, no doubt in anticipation of some food. Yet there was no hint of anyone being around. Take away the sound of the birds overhead, and the place was silent. Standing outside, Michael had to consider what to do. If anyone was awake in this hut, they could not have failed to see him approach. Yet surely the natural thing to do would be to exit and seek to identify a stranger. The other alternative would be to wait inside, in the dark interior, with the means to crown anyone who came over as a threat. A swift look around failed to locate that which Michael was looking for, oars leant against the exterior walls. He would have to search inside, which had the Irishman crossing himself by habit. The creak of that hanging door as he pulled it open was, to his ears, like a siren call, which had him tensing his jaw, and peer as he might, he could not see anything clearly inside. He stepped forward very gingerly indeed, his voice low as he spoke.
"God bless all here."
The greeting got no response, which emboldened him to move a little further forward, but he stopped, letting his eyes become accustomed to the gloom before taking another step. The shape was slow to be identifiable, and it was as much the dog whining at its feet that had him looking to make sense of it. A man, slumped over a table, one hand stretched out, and by it a tipped-over dark brown bottle, the hair dirty, grey and matted, but with no other features visible. A pair of oars sat just inside the doorway, not more than a hand's reach away, and that he did. There was a touch of conscience then, for Michael O'Hagan was not of the robbing type, and he knew he was about to do that to this poor fellow. Oars were to hand, and that bottle might not be the sole thing to hold and carry water. So, putting aside his scruples, he stepped forward, then stopped. The cold of the metal against his head was enough for that, though the deep voice was another good reason.
"Got him, Jed."
The head was slowly lifted off the table, and Michael found himself looking into a pair of gleaming eyes and the barrel of a pistol, aimed right at his heart.
"Never fails, that old mutt, do it, Francis? Jack Tars being such soft-hearted sods. They see a starving dog, and they just has to come and investigate. You'll be looking for the means to row that boat, will you not? And what have you found? Just two of the sharpest bounty boys in creation, that's what. You got the press running all over the county looking for you, but Francis and I, we know you could not have got away unspotted. So we set our little trap, one that has served us well in times past."
The other pistol, for it could only be that, pressed a little harder on Michael's temple.
"He's a big bugger, this one." "Pity being,"
the man called Jed replied in a joshing tone.
"They don't pay bounties by the pound weight. I can only see his outline, but we could retire on this sort if they did." "The other two?" demanded the fellow called Francis.
"What other two?"
"Don't bother with lying, Paddy,"
snarled Jed, who had immediately picked up Michael's accent.
"There were 3 sets of feet come off that beast to the west, and my bet is you was stuck together.
All you have to do is hello from that there door and call them forward."
"They're too sharp to fall for that," Michael said quietly.
"Tell them you found some beer, or maybe even rum. Never met a man in the sea yet who could resist a tot of rum."
Michael O'Hagan was a fighter, as well as a fellow who had done enough bare-knuckle in his time to know that the key to the art was balance. As they had exchanged these words, his mind had been working, as had his feet, moving slightly apart to give him purchase. He knew, for he had seen them fired, that pistols were not accurate at much more than 10 paces, which was about the distance between him and the table. Set against that, the fellow called Jed had a steadying elbow on the tabletop, which might help his aim, and that would be further aided by the fact that Michael was standing silhouetted in the doorway.
"We ain't got all day, Paddy."
It was only to gain a moment's delay that Michael replied, "How do you know him, Irish?" Jed laughed, though it was more of a wheeze.
"I thinking he's trying to josh me, Francis, to play for time."
The head of the pistol flicked back and forth, and the voice lost its tone of banter, turning harsh.
"Do as you's told to, or my friend here will blast out what passes for brains in an Irishman's skull."
The waving of the pistol, meant to emphasize the threat, did just the opposite. It gave Michael, a man they no doubt thought, given his bulk, would be slow to move, the split second he needed to act. First, his left hand shot up to deflect the gun at his head. This as he dived sideways towards the stacked pair of oars, his right hand reaching for the rounded base. The sound of Jed's pistol, fired in such a confined space, was deafening, and if the ball hit Michael, he had no way of knowing, for not only was his heart pumping blood to his veins, he had the oar in his hand and was swinging it in a wide arc aimed at the other fellow, this while his foot kicked out to seek to take away his balance. Time seemed to slow to a standstill. There was Jed, screaming abuse, standing now and beginning to move as he turned his discharged pistol into a club. Francis was slow to bring his deflected gun back round and take aim, the barrel wavering slightly, he wanting to make sure he did not miss. So the oar that Michael swung from a position on his knees took his head just at the point where he pulled the trigger. This while the target was trying to get out of the way of the coming ball. What Michael felt along the side of his head was a searing feeling, not pain. What he saw was that oar head take Francis on his temple, with a crack that seemed no less noisy than the pistol shot which accompanied it. There was no time to wait to see how that affected Francis. Michael had to dive at the knees of the man coming at him with his butt raised to strike, and he was in mid-air as his fist shot forward to hit his assailant in the groin, that taking most of the force out of the blow. Yet coming, as it did, from a man of Michael's build, it did enough, forcing Jed to bend forward so sharply his intended blow hit Michael's shoulders, not his head. Next, Jed was lifted bodily and screaming by the knees, as Michael half stood off balance but able to use his feet, his weight taking both men back to the table, into which Jed was smashed. Jed knew he was doomed when Michael got one of his huge hands on the pistol-holding wrist, and, with a twist, broke it. Now Jed's screams were not imprecations, but pleas for mercy mixed with pain, wasted on the Irishman, who had only one aim, which was to see this creature in hell. His blood was up and pumping, and his vision was blurred with hate. Michael was above him now as he lay in the splintered remains of that table, with the giant, using the heel of his hand to protect his own finger bones, pounding at his head until the screams faded to silence. Even then Michael did not stop, reducing the face before him to bloody pulp. A groan from behind him stopped the assault, and Michael took up one of the legs of the smashed table and went towards the second crimp. One swinging blow was enough, a crack on the head that told of broken bone, and it was raised again with Michael, chest heaving, just about to deliver a swing that would, if he had not done so already, have killed the man. He stopped, for the first time aware of the blood running down his face, as well as the stinging sensation in his temple. That warranted no more than a wipe and a curse. Throwing his table leg aside, he gathered up both pistols, a search of Francis producing the means to reload, while the coat Jed had not been wearing had in it a purse containing a little money, and, beside it, a sack containing food and bottles. Michael knew he had to work quickly. Those 2 pistol shots, even fired indoors, would have reverberated across this featureless land.
which would alert anyone who heard it, and that might include the press gang. He had to get those oars to the boat and get onto water and away. Grabbing them, sack over one shoulder, pistols stuck in his waistband, he ran out of the door, his girth so wide and his aim so unconcerned it knocked the flimsy thing right off the outside wall. Would his mates have run? For they must have heard the shots, and it was the wise thing to do. Much as he reasoned that, he hoped they had waited. He needed someone to look at his wound, for he had no notion of the seriousness of the damage, and he needed him to tend it as well. It was with a feeling of joy he saw them step out of the trees to greet him, with him gabbling about what had happened as he got close. Rufus was examining his head, using a spare shirt to stem the blood flow, when Charlie asked him why, in the name of creation, he had fetched along the dog as well. That was before he aimed a boot at the creature, which had it scurrying away. Chapter 7. Pearce woke in Nerot's hotel to the sound of loud knocking on the door and a grousing voice keen to inform him he had brought his breakfast. It was a voice he recognised from his previous stay, and if it was bad-tempered, he had a good notion of why that should be.
"Which I wish you would shift to open the door, Your Honour. This tray I'm carrying being a weight."
The clerk at the reception table, a haughty sod, had been polite the previous night, if not entirely friendly, an attitude somewhat mollified when Pearce offered to pay for his night's accommodation in advance, as well as asking to leave half his guineas in the care of the hotel safe. Nerot's owners had probably hauled the fellow over the coals for allowing him to get away previously with his bill unsettled, even if it had subsequently been taken care of.
End of CD 3.